The Derbyshire Gorge at this late hour holds a stillness so complete that it seems to have weight, pressing gently against the high limestone walls that rise on either side into the dark sky. There is no wind, not the slightest movement of air, and the rock faces stand like silent guardians, holding the night in place. Above, the sky is perfectly clear, a deep black blue scattered with a dense dusting of stars that appears almost solid in places, a river of light flowing across the heavens. No moon has yet risen, so the only illumination inside the gorge comes from that faint, distant starlight, which catches the pale exposed surfaces of the limestone cliffs and makes them glimmer softly, a cool, white-grey gleam against the profound shadows. The rock itself seems to absorb sound, so that every small noise, the distant trickle of water, the settling of a pebble, is swallowed almost before it can be heard, leaving behind a silence that is not empty but full. A silence that has been accumulating for centuries. The ravine was carved by water over an unimaginable span of time, and the river that did the carving still flows somewhere below, unseen but always present in the steady, hushed murmur that rises from the base of the gorge. That sound never varies, a constant soft whispering of water over stone, threading through the darkness like the breath of the landscape itself. The river is not visible from here, hidden by the deep tangle of shadow and undergrowth at the bottom, but its presence is felt as a coolness that settles in the gorge's lowest places, mixing with the mineral scent of wet limestone. That scent is clean and faintly sharp, like the smell of rain on old stone. But there is no rain tonight, only the accumulated moisture of the earth and the cold rock holding the memory of previous rains. The air itself is cool, almost cold, but not unpleasantly so, and it carries that damp stone fragrance along with the subtler, earthy notes of moss and fern growing in the crevices where moisture never quite dries. Looking up at the cliff faces, you can see the layers of limestone stacked one upon another, a visible history of deep time written in horizontal bands of varying thickness and shade. These rocks began as sediment on an ancient seabed, countless billions of tiny shells and fragments of marine creatures drifting down through warm, shallow waters over millions of years, settling into a thick, calcareous ooze that gradually compressed into stone. Later, the slow, immense forces of the earth lifted that seabed, folding and tilting the strata until they stood exposed to the sky, and then the patient work of water, rain and river, together, carved this gorge through the uplifted rock, revealing the cross-section of time itself. Each band of limestone is slightly different. Some are smooth and fine-grained, others more granular, with tiny fossil inclusions that catch the starlight in a faint sparkle. The layers are marked by darker seams, thin lines of ancient clay or shale that separate one era from the next, running straight or gently undulating across the sheer walls. In the dim light, these seams look like the strokes of a brush, a giant's handwriting across the canvas of the cliff. The darkness in the gorge is not uniform. Near the top of the walls, where the rock meets the sky, the starlight is a little stronger, outlining the jagged edge against the softer blackness of the heavens. Lower down, shadows deepen into a thick, velvety black that seems to have substance, pooling in the hollows and under the overhangs. In the very deepest part of the shadows, huddled against the base of the cliff, there is a shape that at first appears to be just another outcrop of rock, a massive rounded form that follows the natural contours of the stone. But it is too regular, too deliberately shaped, and as your eyes adjust, you begin to see it for what it is, a large draw kiln, built of the same limestone, but cut and laid by human hands, standing dormant and cold, like an enormous beehive of stone. Its curving wall rises to a height of perhaps 20 feet, tapering slightly toward the top, and its surface is weathered and dark, stained by years of heat and soot, though now it is entirely cold, showing no glow of fire. The mouth of the kiln at the top is a round, dark opening, like a great throat frozen in silence. At the base, a low arched tunnel, the drawhole, is a deeper patch of black, a doorway into the kiln's interior that seems to swallow even the faintest gleam of starlight. The kiln is built into the hillside, using the natural slope for ease of loading, and a wide shelf of flat rock has been cleared around it to form a working platform. This platform is empty now, completely still, the packed stone surface pale with a fine layer of limestone dust that glows faintly in the starlight, a ghost powder that marks every surface and object near the kiln. From the platform, a path winds upward along the side of the gorge, a pale ribbon against the darker rock, its surface composed of crushed limestone that reflects the sky's faint light with a soft luminescence. This path is steep, but regular, worn by the passage of many feet over many years into a smooth, gently curving trail that disappears into the darkness high above. The crushed stone that paves it is the same material that the lime burner will soon transform. Broken remnants of the very rock that surrounds this place, ground down under boots and cartwheels until it is a fine, pale dust that rises in a small puff with every step. Tonight, no steps disturb it. The path lies empty, waiting, curving up toward the rim of the gorge and the unseen fields beyond, and its steady rise is the only break in the steep verticality of the cliffs. Along its edges, hardy grasses and small shrubs have taken root in the thin soil, their dark forms barely visible against the pale dust. They stand motionless, their leaves hanging limp in the still air, adding to the sense of a world holding its breath. Below the platform, the ground slopes away steeply toward the river, a tangled slope of scree and boulders that have tumbled from the cliffs over the centuries. These fallen rocks are piled in chaotic heaps, some as large as cottages, others no bigger than a fist, all of them angular and harsh beneath their mantles of lichen. Between them, slender birch and rowan trees have seated themselves, their pale trunks standing out against the darker stone, their branches bare and intricate against the sky. In this season, late autumn or perhaps early winter, the leaves have long since fallen, leaving only the skeletal outlines of twigs that seem to trace delicate patterns in the air. The lichen on the rocks is a muted grey-green, almost silver in the starlight, growing in slow circles that spread year by year, the slowest clock in the gorge. The scree slope holds the cold of the night, radiating a sense of ancient, patient stillness that has nothing to do with the quick pulse of human time. The river itself, hidden in its channel at the very bottom, is a presence more felt than seen. Its sound is a constant, low, liquid whispering that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a backdrop so steady that you soon cease to notice it consciously, though it continues. A thread woven into the fabric of the night. It is not a loud river, not here. The water runs shallow over a bed of smooth limestone cobbles, and that running makes a musical, endlessly varied yet endlessly similar pattern of soft gurgles, tiny splashes, and the gentle sucking of eddies around larger stones. If you were to stand at the edge of the bank, you would see the water as a moving band of deeper black, the starlight glinting off its surface here and there in quick, fleeting sparks that die as soon as they are born. But from the Kiln platform, the river is hidden by the darkness and the angle of the slope, and only its voice reaches upward, a reassuring sound that speaks of continuity and the slow passage of time. The cold air that settles in the gorge carries with it not only the scent of stone and water, but also something else, a faint, clean sharpness that is the limestone itself, a smell that might be described as the ghost of the ancient sea from which it came. It is a smell that speaks of purity and great age, a mineral cleanness that seems to scrub the air of any taint. If you breathe deeply, you can taste it on your tongue, a slight chalky dryness that is not unpleasant. The cold also brings the sense of the moorland above, a faint hint of heather and damp earth that has drifted down from the high ground, mixing with the gorge's own mineral breath to create a unique perfume of this place and this hour. This mingling of scents is stable, unchanging, as if the air itself has become fixed in a perfect balance, and it will remain so until dawn, when the first stirrings of warmth will release new aromas from the earth and the vegetation. High above the gorge, the stars continue their slow, imperceptible procession across the sky, wheeling about the pole with a motion that is only visible over hours. If you were to lie on your back on the platform and watch, you might notice after a long time that the patterns have shifted, that a bright star that was just touching the edge of the cliff has now disappeared behind it, or that a new one has crept into view above the opposite rim. But that movement is so gradual that it seems not to happen at all. It is a change that accumulates in tiny increments, like the growth of the lichen on the rocks. The constellations are sharp and clear, the Great Bear tilting on its tail, the W of Cassiopeia hanging like a bright scribble, and the summer triangle of Vega, Deneb and Altair, though it is late in the year for them, still visible in the west before they set. The Milky Way, that dense band of countless distant suns, arches across the entire sky, a faintly luminous river mirroring the dark river below, a highway of light that the ancient peoples might have imagined as a celestial reflection of the limestone gorge itself. The darkness in the gorge is so deep that it seems to have a texture, a soft velvety quality that wraps itself around every object and softens all edges. The big limestone blocks that litter the platform are reduced to smooth, rounded masses of shadow, their sharp corners blurred away. The mouth of the kiln, that perfect circle of black, seems almost to float against the slightly less black of the kiln side, a door into a deeper dimension of night. The drawhole at the base is a black so profound that looking at it is like looking into the void before creation, an absence of light so complete it feels as if it could pull you in. Yet there is nothing threatening about this darkness. It is a calm, natural dark, the kind that has existed since long before there were eyes to see it. It is a darkness that invites rest, that soothes the mind with its absolute simplicity, its lack of any demand or stimulus. In this dark, the only thing to do is to be still, and the gorge seems to understand that, holding itself in perfect repose. The flat rock of the loading platform, smoothed by decades of boot soles and the scraping of tools, extends around the kiln in a generous apron, providing room to stack materials and move about the work. Tonight it is bare, the fuel and limestone piles that will soon stand here absent, leaving only the faint white powder that coats everything. That dust is so fine that it puffs into the air at the lightest disturbance, but now it lies undisturbed, a thin, even coating that catches the starlight with a subtle sheen, making the ground look as if it were lightly dusted with snow. There are traces of old work embedded in the stone, a scatter of small coal fragments, dark spots against the pale, and here and there a piece of limestone that escaped the kiln, now collected and waiting to be added to the next charge. Near the kiln's mouth, a rusty iron bar leans against the stonework, left from the last shift, its surface mottled with corrosion but still strong. Beside it, a wooden rake with thick, sturdy tines rests on its side, the wood darkened and polished by the lime dust and the oils from many hands. These tools are the only signs of human presence, the only hints that a man will soon arrive and begin the night's slow labor. The gorge walls themselves, so close on either side, create a sense of enclosure that is not oppressive but protective, like being cupped in the palm of a giant stone hand. The rock is not uniform. In places, vertical fissures split the face, deep cracks that run from top to bottom, some wide enough for a thin tree to take root, others just hairline separations that will someday yield a slab to frost and gravity. These cracks provide drainage for the rain that falls on the high moor, channeling it downward in a hidden network of capillaries that eventually join the river. In the wetter seasons, water seeps from these fissures in silver threads that glisten in the daylight, but tonight they are dry, the recent weather having been settled, leaving the rock faces matte and still. Along the base of the cliffs, ferns and mosses cling in the crevices, their fronds and cushions dark and compact, conserving moisture against the cold. They add a texture of softness to the otherwise hard, angular scenery, a living skin over the ancient bones of the earth. The air temperature is such that if you were to stand still for a long time, you would feel the cold gradually seeping through your clothing, not biting but insistent, a slow transfer of heat from your body to the stone and the air. The platform, being elevated and open, is marginally warmer than the valley floor where cold air pools, but the difference is slight. The cold makes the still air feel clean and thin, sharpening the senses even as the darkness dulls them. It is the kind of cold that makes you aware of your own breathing, the small clouds of vapor that form and dissipate with each slow exhale. Tonight there is no one here to exhale, and so the air remains perfectly clear. No mist gathering except far down by the river, where the water's relative warmth raises a thin layer of fog that clings to the surface like a ghost and moves sluggishly with the current. The kiln, for all its mass and solidity, is a structure of profound patience. It can wait. It has waited through many nights like this, cold and unlit, and it will wait through many more. Its stones, fitted without mortar in the old way, hold together by weight and friction, each one shaped to interlock with its neighbors in a sturdy ring that can withstand the tremendous heat of the fire and the weight of the stone charge. The inner lining, the fire brick, is a special refractory material that glows cherry red when hot, but now it is dark and cool, smelling faintly of old wood smoke and calcined lime, a residual perfume from the last burn that will never fully dissipate. That smell, if you put your head near the draw hole, is still detectable, a ghost of the fire that once raged inside, a promise of the fire that will soon burn again. But that is all in the future. Right now, the kiln is asleep, and the entire gorge is asleep, wrapped in the silent starry night, waiting. Above the eastern rim of the gorge, though no hint of light yet shows, the sky holds the merest suggestion of a future change. In a few hours, the stars there will begin to fade. The black will give way to a deep, cold blue, and the first tentative light of dawn will spill over the edge, slowly illuminating the layers of rock and the dormant kiln. But that is still far off, an event in another chapter of the night. For now, the darkness is absolute and unbroken. The stars are steady, the river murmurs on, and the gorge rests in a peace so deep it feels eternal. Nothing moves. Nothing stirs. The limestone dust settles on the platform, the cold air holds its fragrance, and the world waits for the lime burner to arrive. High above the gorge, where the crushed limestone path meets the dark rim of the moor, a tiny point of light appears among the black heather and the sleeping grass. It is so faint at first that it might be mistaken for a low star, a warm yellow speck just above the horizon, but it moves, swaying slightly with a slow, steady motion that no star ever makes. As it begins to descend the steep track, the light grows gradually brighter, separating into the distinct glow of several small oil lamps bundled together, their flames sheltered behind panels of thin horn that diffuse the brightness into a soft orange-gold halo. The lamps are carried by a man whose form is still only a dark outline against the wider darkness, a shape moving with the deliberate care of someone who has walked this path many hundred times and knows every stone and turn by heart. His name is Peter, though there is no one here to speak it, and he is the lime burner come to begin the night's slow work. The path winds downward in a series of gentle switchbacks carved into the side of the gorge, and Peter follows its course without needing to look at his feet. His boots, heavy and thick-soled, make a soft, regular sound on the crushed stone, a quiet crunch and shuffle that repeats with each step, a steady rhythm that seems to belong naturally to the night. The leather of his boots is old and well-oiled, darkened by years of lime dust and damp, and the soles are studded with small iron nails that grip the loose surface with a reassuring firmness. As he descends, the lamp glow pushes back the darkness around him, illuminating a small circle of the path, the pale dust, the occasional tuft of wiry grass at the edge, and the steep rocky wall rising on one side. Beyond that circle, the darkness closes in again, thick and immediate, so that Peter seems to carry his own small world of light with him, down into the black gorge. He wears simple, dark woolen clothes that do not show the lime dust easily, a heavy, long-sleeved shirt, thick trousers patched at the knees, and a wool cap pulled low over his forehead against the cold. Over this, a worn canvas coat hangs to his thighs, its fabric stiffened by years of exposure to the kiln's heat and the fine alkaline powder that works its way into every fiber. The coat makes a quiet, continuous rubbing sound as he moves, a soft whisper of canvas against wool, and the slight creak of his shoulders shifting under the load of the iron bar he carries across his back. That bar, a length of forged iron perhaps 6 feet long, rests diagonally from his hip to his opposite shoulder, one end blunt and squared for use as a tamping tool, the other slightly flattened into a wedge for nudging stones. It is heavy and cold, and he grips it loosely with one hand while the other hand holds the wooden handle of the covered lantern. The iron has been blackened by the fire long ago, and its surface is pitted with rust that feels rough under his leather-wrapped fingers. Peter moves not with the tense caution of someone in danger, but with the relaxed, energy-saving pace of a man who knows that a full shift of steady labor lies ahead and that there is no profit in hurrying. His steps are measured, his breathing even, and he holds his body upright, but not rigid, letting the slope do some of the work of carrying him downward. Occasionally he pauses for a moment, not because he is tired, but simply to let the night settle around him after the small disturbance of his passage. During these pauses he listens to the gorge, his head tilted slightly, and the lamp glow steadies, illuminating the weathered skin of his face, a face of middle age, lined but not deeply scored, with calm eyes that reflect the lamplight without any show of hurry or worry. He is a man who has spent most of his life in this slow rhythm of night work, and his bearing carries the quiet assurance of absolute familiarity. The descent from the moor top to the kiln platform takes the better part of 20 minutes at this careful pace, and throughout that time, the lamps burn steadily, consuming their small reservoirs of fish oil with a faint, not unpleasant smell that mingles with the cleaner scent of the cold night air. The horn panels of the lantern are translucent, mellowing the flame into a soft glow that does not dazzle his eyes, preserving his ability to see into the darkness beyond. As he rounds the last switchback, the gorge opens out below him, and the massive shape of the draw kiln becomes visible against the base of the far cliff, its rounded bulk just emerging from the general shadow as a deeper darkness that blocks out a patch of stars. Peter's lamplight is too weak to reach that far, but he knows exactly where the kiln stands, and he does not need to see it to feel its presence, a familiar solidity in the immensity of the night. The path levels out onto the wide shelf of flat rock that serves as the loading platform, and the sound of his boots changes from the soft crunch of loose stones to a harder, sharper sound on the packed and swept surface. The layer of pale limestone dust that covers everything puffs up in tiny clouds around his feet, catching the lamplight like a low mist that settles again almost instantly. Peter steps onto the platform and walks directly to the kiln, where a rusted iron hook projects from the stonework beside the great dark opening of the charging mouth. He lifts the lantern carefully, its bale squeaking slightly, and hangs it on the hook, where it will cast its light across the workspace for the rest of the night. The flame wavers for a moment as the lantern finds its balance, then steadies, and a warm limited pool of yellow light spreads across the kiln's curving wall and the stone platform. The darkness, driven back a few feet, now waits at the edges of that pool like a patient animal. With the lantern secure, Peter shrugs the iron bar from his shoulder and leans it carefully against the kiln wall, in the same spot where his predecessor had left it days before. The sound of iron on stone, a dull, reassuring clink. He flexes his shoulders once, loosening the muscles that had borne the bar's weight, and then he stands still, letting his arms drop to his sides. He faces outward, away from the kiln, looking down toward where the river moves unseen through the black bottom of the gorge, and he simply listens. The gentle, unvarying murmur of the water is exactly what it always is, a constant low voice that has been speaking since long before he was born and will continue long after. It is a sound he could describe in his sleep, the many-layered, quiet rushing and gurgling of shallow water over smooth stones, and it settles into his mind like a comforting touch, the signal that all is as it should be. The ribbon of the river, though invisible from the platform, can be traced by the faintest possible sheen where starlight catches the moving surface in brief, shifting glimmers. Peter watches those glimmers for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly along the unseen course, and he notices, without particularly thinking about it, that the water level is normal for the season, neither high from rain nor low from drought. That is good, though it does not directly affect his work. It is just one more detail that contributes to the overall sense of rightness that he values before beginning a burn. The cold air rises from the river, carrying its cool, damp breath up the scree slope, and he feels it on his cheeks, a fresh sharpness that is already beginning to be tempered by the faint warmth radiating from the dormant kiln, a ghost of the fire that still smoulders far within. There is no hurry in Peter, none at all. He has the whole night ahead of him, a full span of darkness that will stretch from this moment of arrival to the first grey light of dawn, and every minute of it will be filled with the quiet, repetitive tasks of his trade. He knows precisely how long the work will take, how many baskets of coal and stone he must lift and pour, how many times he will circle the kiln to check the draw hole and the wall temperature. Rushing would save him no time, because the burn itself dictates the pace, a slow chemical transformation that cannot be hurried. So he allows himself these few minutes of stillness, this brief threshold between the outside world and the night's labor, and he uses them to let his mind settle into the calm, empty state that the work requires. After a while, he turns his attention to his hands. He is already wearing his leather wrappings, but he checks them now with the same careful, automatic attention that a sailor gives to a familiar knot. The wrappings are simple rectangles of thick cowhide, worn smooth and dark, that he binds around his palms and the bases of his fingers, leaving his fingertips free for fine work, while protecting the flesh from the worst of the heat and the abrasive lime. He tightens the leather laces that run through eyelets along the edges, pulling them snug with his teeth, then flexes his fingers several times to ensure the wrappings do not bind. The leather is stiff with age and impregnated with a fine white dust that has worked into the grain, and it smells of old sweat and wood smoke and the peculiar dry scent of quicklime. These ham wrappings, along with the canvas coat, are his only protective gear, and they are enough because he knows how to handle the materials without putting himself at risk. He next checks the lantern, lifting it briefly from its hook to open the small door in the horn casing and adjust the wick, trimming away the charred end with a tiny pair of snips that he carries in his coat pocket. The flame leaps up, then settles into a cleaner, brighter burn, and the light on the platform grows a shade more certain. He closes the door and rehangs the lantern, satisfied. The circle of illumination now reaches far enough to show him the wooden rake lying where it was left, the shallow loading baskets stacked beside the cold mouth of the kiln, and the first faint outlines of the two large material piles that stand at the edge of the platform. One dark, one pale. The coal pile and the limestone pile, the twin supplies for the night's work. Peter walks to the edge of the platform where the crushed limestone path gives way to the raw stone of the cliff, and he looks up at the sky. The stars are as they were, the Great Bear tilting toward the horizon, Cassiopeia still hanging in the northeast. He locates the bright point of Jupiter, low in the south, and notes its position relative to the rim of the gorge. He has no clock, no timepiece of any kind, and he does not need one. The sky itself is his clock, and the steady wheeling of the stars tells him more accurately than any mechanism when midnight has passed, when dawn is approaching. Right now, by the position of the planets and the angle of the constellations, he judges that it is still early in the night, perhaps 2 hours before midnight, which gives him plenty of time to load the first layers and bring the kiln up to its proper burn before the deepest cold of the early morning sets in. He lowers his gaze, breathes out a long, slow breath that turns to vapor and is swallowed by the dark, and walks back to the kiln. The first quiet preparations have nothing to do with coal or limestone. Before any fresh material can be added, Peter must ensure that the kiln is ready to receive it, that the pathways for air and fire are clear. He walks around the wide base of the kiln to the draw hole, the low arched opening at the bottom where the burned quicklime will eventually be raked out. He kneels down, the cold stone pressing through the fabric of his trousers, and peers into the absolute blackness of the tunnel. Warm air, very faintly warm, breathes out against his face, carrying the smell of old ash and that peculiar, almost sweet mineral scent of calcium oxide. He reaches in with the iron bar, feeling carefully for any obstructions, any fallen bricks or clinkers that might block the flow of air. The bar scrapes gently against the fire brick floor, meeting no resistance, and he withdraws it with a nod. The draught is clear, the kiln's throat open and ready. He stands again, brushing the dust from his knees, and makes a slow circuit of the kiln's exterior, running his leather-wrapped hand over the stonework as he walks. The stones are cold to the touch on the outside, but if he holds his palm in one place for a long moment, he can sense a deeper residual warmth radiating from the core, the banked embers of last week's fire that were never fully extinguished. That latent heat is the foundation on which he will build tonight's burn, a seed of fire that only needs fresh fuel and the steady pull of air through the kiln's height to blossom back into a full, roaring heat. He can feel it best at the narrow observation holes that pierce the kiln wall at intervals, small openings no bigger than his fist, plugged with loose stones. He removes one of these plugs and puts his eye to the hole, but there is nothing to see yet, only darkness and that faint exhalation of warm air like the breath of a sleeping giant. Everything is in order. The kiln is ready. Peter returns to the platform in front of the charging mouth, where the lantern hangs and the tools rest. He picks up the wooden rake, its handle worn smooth by the grip of many hands, and inspects the tines. They are sturdy, carved from a single piece of ash, darkened with soot and age but showing no cracks. He tests the rake's weight, swinging it gently in a short arc, then sets it back in its place against the kiln wall. Next to it, the shallow loading baskets are stacked 3 deep, each one woven from split willow and reinforced at the rim with a band of iron. The baskets are designed to hold about 30 pounds of stone or coal, a weight that can be lifted and carried repeatedly throughout a long night without exhausting a man. He selects one and checks its bottom, running his fingers over the woven strands to feel for any breaks. The basket is sound. He sets it aside for immediate use. Now at last, Peter turns to the two material piles that stand at the far edge of the platform, and he approaches them with the same quiet, methodical pace. The coal pile is a dark heap, irregular and jagged, the individual pieces glossy in the lamplight where the beam catches their fractured surfaces. The coal smells faintly of hydrocarbons, a tarry, ancient smell that speaks of forests buried long before the first human drew breath. The limestone pile, lighter in color, is composed of chunks that range in size from a man's fist to a man's head, their edges sharp and fresh where they were broken at the quarry. They smell clean and cold, like the bedrock of the world. Peter bends down and picks up a lump from each pile, one in each hand, holding them up to the light as he has done 1,000 times before. He looks at the fine grain of the limestone, the tiny sparkling crystals of calcite, and he looks at the layered, shiny surface of the coal, the way it fractures into cubic pieces. Then he places both lumps back on their respective piles, a small ritual of acknowledgement, and straightens up. The night's work is about to begin. The tools are ready, the materials are waiting, and the kiln stands open-mouthed and patient. Peter takes up the first empty basket and carries it to the coal pile, his boots sounding softly on the stone platform, his canvas coat whispering with his movement. And the lantern burns steadily on its hook, casting its limited golden light over the scene. The river continues its endless murmur, the stars continue their slow wheel, and the lime burner, without any outward sign of haste or ceremony, begins the long, slow process of loading the kiln that will occupy him until the first pale light of dawn touches the high cliffs of the gorge. The kiln that stands against the dark cliff wall of the Derbyshire Gorge is not simply a structure of stone and firebrick. It is a vessel for transformation, a patient and permanent architecture designed to change the very nature of rock through the steady application of heat. Its form, shaped like a vast egg cup or an inverted bell, has been refined over centuries of lime burning, each generation passing down small improvements until the design achieves a kind of perfection for its single purpose. The outer walls are built of the same limestone that surrounds it, rough-hewn blocks fitted so precisely without mortar that they have held together through decades of expansion and contraction, through the tremendous heat of countless fires and the cold stillness of the dormant seasons. These walls rise to a height that allows a man to stand comfortably on the charging platform and look down into the deep dark throat, and they taper slightly toward the top, a subtle inward curve that strengthens the structure against the outward pressure of the heated stone. The base is wider, spreading into the solid foundation that rests on the natural bedrock, and the whole mass of the kiln seems to grow out of the hillside, a shape that belongs to the gorge as much as the cliffs themselves. At the very top, the charging mouth opens in a perfect circle, lined with a ring of specially cut stones that resist the abrasion of countless loads of limestone and coal being tipped through. This opening is the only way in for fresh material, and its diameter is carefully judged to allow the easy passage of a loaded basket while still concentrating the rising heat into a column that preheats the fresh stone before it enters the fire zone. The mouth is dark now, a perfect O of black against the slightly lighter darkness of the kiln's outer wall. But when the burn is fully established, a faint shimmer of heat will rise from it like a transparent flame, distorting the stars beyond. Around the mouth, the broad charging platform extends in a level apron of packed stone and earth, swept clean of loose material, providing the lime burner with a stable working area from which he can load the kiln, monitor the descending charge, and manipulate the top of the stone bed with his long iron tools. Below the charging mouth, the interior of the kiln drops away in a carefully shaped vertical shaft that widens slightly below the throat before tapering again toward the base, creating a profile that controls the flow of both material and air. This profile is not a simple cylinder, but a calculated curve, an egg shape that allows the charge of limestone and coal to settle gradually as it descends, the pieces shifting and settling without jamming, while the upward draft of combustion air finds its path through the loose, piled mass. The shaft is lined with firebrick, a refractory material made from special clays that can withstand the intense heat of the burning zone, heat that would melt or crack ordinary stone. These bricks are shaped to fit the curve, each one a wedge in a vast three-dimensional puzzle, and their inner surface is smooth, almost waxy, worn glassy by the passage of hot gases and the slow, abrasive movement of descending stone. The firebrick lining is the kiln's true heart, the part that endures the fiercest conditions, and it must be inspected regularly for any cracks or erosion that could compromise the entire structure. Near the bottom of the shaft, the profile narrows again into a constriction that holds the burning zone in place, preventing the fire from spreading too high or too low. And below this constriction, the kiln opens into the draw tunnel, an arched passageway that extends horizontally to the outside. This draw hole is the exit point for the finished quicklime, which collects in the cooling zone at the very base and is raked out in batches. The arch of the draw hole is built of shaped stone that distributes the enormous weight above it, and the tunnel floor is paved with firebrick that slopes gently downward, aiding the extraction of the burned lime. At the outer end, the draw hole is a low, dark aperture that faces the riverside of the gorge, and when the kiln is in full operation, a deep, steady glow emanates from within, the color of embers seen through a layer of ash. Tonight the glow is only the faintest possible suggestion, a dim orange memory that breathes warmth rather than light, but it is the proof that the kiln is never truly cold, that the heart of fire sleeps within. Running vertically through the center of the entire shaft is the invisible column of rising air, the draught that is the kiln's breath. Air enters through the draw hole, drawn by the heat of the fire above, and it passes upward through the burning zone, where the carbon in the coal combines with oxygen in a slow, continuous combustion that releases the heat needed to calcine the limestone. The hot gases then continue upward, preheating the fresh stone and fuel that have been newly added at the top, transferring their energy with a steady efficiency before escaping through the charging mouth as the shimmering exhaust. This upward flow is the engine of the entire process, and it depends on a delicate balance. The fire must be hot enough to create a strong draft, but not so hot that it chars the stone or melts the firebrick. The charge must be loose enough to allow the gases to pass, but dense enough to hold the heat within the kiln. The lime burner's skill lies in maintaining this balance through the long hours of the burn, feeling the state of the kiln through subtle signs that no written manual could ever capture. Peter, standing on the platform with the lantern glowing beside him, understands all of this, not as theory but as a bodily knowledge that lives in his hands and his eyes and the soles of his feet. He has spent 30 years learning the language of draw kilns, and the kiln in this gorge is as familiar to him as his own cottage. Before he begins loading, there are small preparatory tasks that must be done, acts of maintenance that ensure the night's work will proceed without interruption. The first of these is sweeping the charging platform, which has accumulated a thin layer of fine limestone dust and scattered fragments since the last burn was completed. He takes up the basin broom that leans near the tool rest, its bristles made of heather bundled tightly and bound with wire, and he begins to sweep in slow, even strokes that move the pale dust toward the outer edge of the platform, where it falls into the darkness and is swallowed by the gorge. The sound of the broom is a steady, soft whisper, a hushing that blends with the river's distant murmur and the quiet hiss of the lantern. Peter works methodically, beginning at the far side of the platform and working inward toward the kiln mouth, his strokes overlapping so that no patch of dust is left behind. The bristles of the broom wear evenly, having been trimmed by long use to exactly the right angle for this surface, and they leave the packed stone clean and slightly polished, ready to receive the night's foot traffic. As he sweeps near the kiln mouth, he pauses to brush away the dust that has settled on the charging ring, ensuring that the stones are clear and that no loose material will fall into the kiln when he begins tipping the baskets. The dust rises in small pale clouds that catch the lamplight and drift slowly away, and he breathes through his nose, his mouth set in a relaxed line, accustomed to the fine powder that is as much a part of this work as the stone itself. When the platform is clean, Peter leans the broom back against its resting place and turns his attention to the interior of the kiln. The charging mouth, that wide circle at the top, is his closest point of access to the shaft, and he leans forward carefully. his hands braced on the stone ring, peering down into the profound darkness. The faint warmth that rises against his face is the first confirmation that the kiln still lives, a ghost of heat from the banked embers somewhere far below. His eyes, adjusted to the lamp glow, can make out nothing in that vertical blackness, but he does not need to see. He needs to feel. He reaches for the long iron bar that he carried down from the moor, the bar that is both his tamping rod and his probe, and he slides it carefully through the mouth, lowering it slowly into the shaft until its end comes to rest on the surface of the old charge, still within. The bar meets the pile with a soft, gritty sensation, and he feels through the iron the texture of the material, loose and granular, the ash and partly calcined stone that remains from the last burn. He probes the surface in several places, jabbing gently, and the bar sinks easily each time, confirming that the charge is uniformly broken and will allow the fresh layers to settle evenly. Satisfied, he withdraws the iron and leans it against the kiln wall. Next, he descends from the platform, walking carefully down the short, steep path that leads to the base of the kiln and the draw hole. The river sound is louder here, the air cooler and damper, and the massive bulk of the kiln looms above him, blocking a portion of the starry sky. He kneels before the low arch, the same position he will hold many times tonight, and he reaches into the darkness with one hand, feeling for the obstruction that he knows is not there, but that he checks for anyway, because the ritual of checking is part of the work's reliability. The tunnel is clear, the floor cool but not cold, and he can feel the faint current of air moving past his fingers, the kiln's slow inhalation. From his coat pocket he takes a small iron scraper, a tool with a curved blade, and he uses it to clean the edges of the draw hole, removing the thin crust of old lime that sometimes hardens there and could interfere with the rake's passage when the time comes to extract the finished product. The scraping sound is quiet and irregular, a metallic whisper in the dark, and when he is done, he wipes the blade on a rag and returns it to his pocket. Now comes the most intimate inspection, the one that carries the most meaning for Peter. He moves to the side of the kiln, where a row of small observation holes pierce the outer wall at intervals of roughly 3 feet, each one plugged with a loose stone that fits like a stopper. These holes are known as spy holes or trial holes, and they allow the lime burner to gauge the progress of the fire and the condition of the charge at different levels. Peter removes the plug from the lowest hole, the one just above the draw arch, and he leans close, holding his leather-wrapped hand before the opening to feel the temperature of the escaping air. The warmth is distinct but not strong, the remnant breath of the embers, and it carries the dry, slightly sweet smell of calcium oxide, the smell of quicklime. He then replaces the plug and moves upward to the next hole, repeating the procedure. The air here is cooler, the residual heat less apparent, and the smell is fainter, more of ash than of lime. At the highest hole, the one just below the charging platform, there is no detectable warmth at all, only the cool mineral smell of raw limestone and the dry scent of old coal. This is the pattern he expects. A gentle gradient from cool at the top to warm at the base, and it tells him that the kiln is in a sound condition, ready to be filled. Before returning to the platform, Peter does one more thing that is both practical and deeply habitual. He removes his leather hand wrappings for a moment, sliding them off and tucking them into his belt, and he reaches through the lowest spy hole with his bare fingers to touch the fire brick lining inside. The brick is smooth and slightly greasy to the touch, a result of the glassy slag that forms on its surface during the burn, and its temperature is warm but not hot, about the warmth of a sun-heated stone in late afternoon. He traces his fingers over the curved surface, feeling for any cracks or spalling, any sign that the brick is failing. The surface is sound, the smoothness unbroken, and he withdraws his hand, satisfied. He wipes his fingers on his coat, re-dons the leather wrappings, and climbs back to the platform, his boots sounding with the same soft, deliberate pace that marks all his movements. Back at the top, the lantern still burns steadily, and the river still murmurs, and the stars still wheel. Peter stands for a moment, one hand resting on the warm, curved stone of the kiln's outer wall, and he lets his mind settle into the knowledge that all is ready. The kiln is not merely a tool, a dead object to be used. It is a presence, almost a partner in the labor, with its own character and its own demands. To treat it as a simple oven, would be to misunderstand it completely. A draw kiln lives in a state of perpetual process, never fully cooling, never fully still. The fire that sleeps in its core is the same fire that has been burning in one form or another since the kiln was first built, a continuous thread of heat that connects one burn to the next across months and years. When Peter first lit the kiln as a young man, the master lime burner who trained him had told him that a good kiln never goes cold, and that the lime burner's duty is to keep the heart of the fire alive. He has followed that advice ever since, and the latent warmth he feels under his palm now is the proof of his fidelity. This continuity is essential to the kiln's function. If the kiln were allowed to cool completely, the firebrick lining would contract, and the resulting cracks would weaken the structure and allow heat to escape. The ritual of maintaining a banked fire, a deep bed of embers covered with a layer of ash to restrict the air, keeps the kiln in a state of readiness. When fresh fuel is added and the draft is opened, the embers wake quickly, the small glowing coals spreading their warmth to ignite the new coal from below. The process is gentle, a gradual awakening rather than a sudden blaze. And it is this gentleness that ensures the limestone calcines evenly, without shattering or melting. The limestone, a dense carbonate of calcium, must be heated slowly and steadily to a temperature that drives off the carbon dioxide locked within its crystal structure, leaving behind the pure calcium oxide, the quicklime. If the heating is too rapid, the stone may crack or fuse, and the resulting product will be uneven and inferior. The draw kiln, with its banked fire and its massive heat-retaining walls, is designed to deliver that steady temperature day and night without fluctuation. Peter, as he prepares to begin the night's loading, embodies this philosophy of steadiness. His movements are neither fast nor slow, his breathing is even, and his attention is turned inward to the work, as if the kiln and the materials and the night have absorbed his entire consciousness. He picks up the first shallow basket, its willow strands pale and supple, and he walks to the coal pile, ready to carry the first of many loads to the charging mouth. The architecture of the kiln, its deep shaft and curved firebrick, its draw hole and spy holes, its massive stone walls and open mouth, is the stage on which the long, slow drama of transformation will unfold. And the lime burner, moving with the patient certainty of long practice, is the quiet hand that guides it. The two piles of material that stand at the far edge of the loading platform are separate but equal partners in the long night's work. One dark and one pale, each waiting in its own particular silence for Peter's hands. The coal pile is a jagged accumulation of deep black fragments, its surface glinting faintly in the lantern light where the beam catches the glossy planes of freshly fractured surfaces, while the limestone pile, larger and more massive, holds the cool grey tones of the bedrock from which it was quarried. Both piles have been delivered by cart from the pits and the quarry face, hauled along the high moor tracks, and then tipped down a wooden chute that channels the loose stone to this wide shelf beside the kiln. They have rested here for several days, settling into their own shapes, and the dust that coats everything on the platform has settled on them too. A fine pale powder that softens the sharp edges of the coal and gives the limestone a ghostly, unified appearance until Peter begins to work with them. The limestone is a stone of great age and quiet dignity, formed in the warm, shallow seas that covered this part of the world many millions of years before anything resembling a human being walked the earth. Those ancient waters were rich with life, with countless billions of tiny creatures, shelled organisms, coral-like colonies, and drifting calcium-secreting algae, all of them living out their brief spans and then settling as a gentle rain of microscopic fragments to the seafloor. Over epochs that dwarf human comprehension, layer upon layer of this biological snow accumulated, compressing under its own weight and under the pressure of later sediments, until the soft ooze hardened into the dense, fine-grained rock that Peter now handles each night. The limestone bears within it the memory of that lost ocean, the invisible chemistry of shells and skeletons reconstituted into a material of practical and essential use. It is a stone that carries deep time in its crystalline lattice, and the process of lime burning is, in a sense, a way of releasing that ancient sea back into the air, driving the captive carbon dioxide from the calcium carbonate and leaving behind a substance that is pure and hungry, eager to recombine with water and begin a new cycle of transformation. In the lamplight, the limestone pieces show a cool, muted grey color, that sometimes carries faint bluish undertones. Where the calcite crystals are particularly pure, the surface of a fresh break is granular and even, like fine-grained sugar compacted into stone, and it sparkles with tiny points of reflected light where the crystals catch the beam at the right angle. There are subtle variations across the pile. Some chunks are a shade darker, indicating a slightly higher clay content, while others are almost white, approaching the purity of marble. All of it, however, is composed overwhelmingly of calcium carbonate, the mineral calcite, with only trace impurities of silica, iron oxide, and organic matter that will influence the final color and quality of the quicklime. The limestone feels cool to the touch, dense and solid, with a heft that is satisfying yet manageable, a weight that speaks of its mineral nature. When Peter picks up a lump, the surface is slightly rough against his leather-wrapped fingers, the sharp edges biting gently into the worn hide, and he can feel the compactness of the stone, the way it resists any attempt to compress it further. The coal, by contrast, is a stone of a different kind entirely, born not from the sea, but from the dense, swampy forests that covered the land in a later geological age. Those forests, dominated by giant ferns and horsetails and primitive trees that have no living descendants, grew in vast, steaming wetlands, the air thick with carbon dioxide and the ground saturated with water. When the trees died and fell, they sank into the acidic, oxygen-poor mire, where decomposition was slow and incomplete. Layer upon layer of this partially decayed plant matter built up over millions of years, peat accumulating in basins that gradually subsided under the weight of later deposits. Heat and pressure, applied over eons, drove off the water and the volatile compounds, concentrating the carbon into the glossy black substance that now lies heaped beside the limestone. The coal is, in a literal sense, fossilized sunlight, the captured energy of prehistoric photosynthesis stored in chemical bonds, waiting to be released by fire. In the lamplight, the coal is not truly black, but a very deep, lustrous grey, the color of a wet raven's wing or the darkest possible shadow. Its surface reflects the yellow glow in oily iridescent highlights that shift as Peter moves around the pile, and where the fragments have broken recently, the fracture surfaces as sharp and conchoidal, curving like thick glass that has been struck with a hammer. The coal fractures into angular, irregular pieces, some blocky and cubic, others splintering into thin, sharp-edged plates, and the pile as a whole has a spiky, restless quality that contrasts with the more settled, rounded shapes of the limestone heap. Each piece of coal is lighter than a piece of limestone of equivalent size, a difference that Peter can feel immediately when he lifts a lump in his hand, the coal seeming almost porous in comparison, its density lower by a considerable margin. The coal leaves a fine, dark dust on whatever it touches, a silky powder that works its way into the grain of his leather wrappings and under his fingernails, marking the hands with the signature of the fuel. Peter, standing between the two piles with his empty willow basket on the ground beside him, picks up a lump from each pile, one in each hand, a gesture so habitual that he performs it without conscious thought. The ritual is a way of grounding himself in the materials, of reacquainting his body with the specific weights and textures that will occupy his attention for the next 8 hours. In his right hand, the limestone sits with a calm, heavy solidity, its cool surface gradually warming against his palm, the granular texture a familiar presence. In his left hand, the coal seems almost lively by comparison, its lighter weight and glassy fracture planes giving it a different kind of presence, a more volatile personality. He holds both pieces up to the lantern, turning them slowly, and his eyes move from one to the other, reading the fine details, the tiny crystals in the limestone, the woody grain patterns still faintly visible in certain fragments of coal. This is the foundational act of the lime burner's trade, the recognition that everything that follows depends on the intimate understanding of these two stones. The transformation that will occur inside the kiln is, in its essence, a chemical reaction of elegant simplicity, though it requires conditions that are far from simple to achieve and maintain. Calcium carbonate, the limestone, decomposes under intense heat into calcium oxide and carbon dioxide gas, a change that begins to happen at around 800 degrees centigrade and proceeds efficiently at temperatures closer to 1000 degrees. The carbon dioxide drifts away as an invisible gas, escaping through the charging mouth and dispersing into the gorge air, while the calcium oxide remains behind in the solid form of quicklime, a white, crumbly material that is chemically quite different from the stone that entered the kiln. Quicklime is alkaline, caustic, and intensely reactive with water, producing a fierce heat of its own when slaked, and it has been used for millennia in mortar, plaster, agriculture, and countless other applications. The coal's role is to provide the heat that drives this decomposition, burning slowly and steadily within the kiln shaft, its carbon combining with the oxygen in the draft to sustain the temperatures required. The secret of a good lime burn lies not in the intensity of the fire, but in its steadiness and its duration. A blast furnace, with its fierce, howling flames and its rapid consumption of fuel, would be entirely unsuitable for this delicate work, because the limestone would shatter from thermal shock or melt into a useless slag before it had fully calcined. What is needed instead is a deep-banked, slow-burning fire that maintains an even temperature throughout a mass of stone that may weigh several tons and that must sit in the heat for days rather than hours. The draw kiln achieves this by using the limestone itself as part of the thermal mass, the stone absorbing heat from the combustion zone and then holding it, radiating it back into the column, so that the fresh material descending from above is gradually preheated before it enters the zone of active burning. The coal, distributed in thin layers between the limestone layers, ignites in sequence as it descends into the hotter regions, each charge of fuel contributing its energy to the long, slow pulse of the burn. This is why the layering must be so precise, why Peter spends so much time and care on the even distribution of each basketful. Because a pocket of fuel-rich mixture would burn too hot and too fast, damaging the fire brick or fusing the stone, while a lean spot would remain cold and produce unburned, useless cores of raw limestone. As Peter stands holding the two stones, his mind falls into a quiet, almost meditative state in which the larger significance of the materials recedes and only their physical reality remains. He feels the weight of the limestone starting to make his right arm ache with a distant, pleasant fatigue, and he feels the coal's silky dust transferring itself to the worn leather of his left palm. The lantern light plays over both surfaces, and the river murmurs its endless accompaniment, and the cold air holds the mixed scents of damp stone and ancient hydrocarbons. In this moment, there is no hurry, no pressure, no thought of the hours ahead. There is only the stone and the fuel and the man who understands them. He has performed this silent ritual hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, and it never loses its quiet power, the simple, wordless communion with the raw materials of his trade. The limestone is not merely a rock, and the coal is not merely a fuel. They are the accumulated history of the earth, concentrated into forms that human skill can shape and transform, and handling them with respect is a duty that Peter takes seriously without ever articulating it. The limestone, for all its apparent uniformity, is actually as varied as the ancient seabed from which it came, and Peter can read its variations with the same fluency that a scholar reads a book. A piece with a slightly yellowish tint has a higher proportion of iron compounds, and it will produce a quicklime that is less purely white, better suited for agricultural use where color is irrelevant. A piece with tiny visible shell fragments, the fossilized remains of crinoids or brachiopods, reminds him of the quarry faces where such fossils are common, and he will often pause to trace the delicate spiral or the regular pattern of ridges with his fingertip before adding the stone to the basket. The purest, whitest limestone, the kind that comes from the deeper beds and is composed almost entirely of microcrystalline calcite, will yield the finest quicklime, the kind that is prized for fine plaster and for the most demanding building work. All of it, however, will transform under the right conditions, and Peter's task is to provide those conditions without favor or prejudice, treating each basketful with the same steady care. The coal, too, has its own spectrum of qualities that Peter has learned to recognize over the years. The best burning coal is the shiny, jet-black variety that fractures with a curved, glassy surface, indicating a high carbon content and a low level of volatile impurities. Some pieces are duller, more brownish, with visible layers of compressed plant material that betray their origins in woody tissue, and these will still burn, but with a smokier, less even flame. There are occasional pieces that are almost pure sulfur, yellow streaks that smell sharply when broken, and that Peter sets aside because they produce a corrosive smoke that can damage the kiln lining. A few chunks, rare but recognizable, contain the delicate impressions of ancient leaves or the flattened, carbonized remains of stems, and when Peter finds these, he sometimes holds them for a moment longer, looking at the ghost of a fern that grew 200 million years ago in a swamp that no longer exists. This recognition of the deep past is not something he thinks about in words. It is a feeling, a quiet awareness of the immense stretch of time that has preceded his own fleeting presence on the earth, and it adds a dimension of gravity to the work that he would never attempt to explain. The partnership between the limestone and the coal is a precise one, dictated by the chemistry of the burn. For every ton of limestone that enters the kiln, a certain proportion of coal is required, a ratio that Peter knows not as a number, but as a bodily intuition developed through years of watching the results of too much or too little fuel. A burn that is too rich in coal will overheat the stone, melting the surfaces and sealing the interior away from the heat so that the core remains raw, a fault known as dead burning. A burn that is too lean will fail to reach the necessary temperature, and the limestone will emerge unchanged or only partially calcined, with a grey, stony heart that must be picked out and discarded. The ideal ratio is about 1 part coal to 6 or 7 parts limestone by weight, but this varies with the quality of both materials, the outside air temperature, the moisture content of the stone, and even the phase of the burn, since a kiln that is already hot requires less fuel to maintain its temperature than one that is being brought up from cold. Peter adjusts his layering instinctively as the night progresses, adding a little more coal here, a little less there, reading the subtle signs that the kiln provides. These signs include the color of the glow from the draw hole, which shifts from a dull cherry red at low temperatures to a bright orange at the proper burning heat, and the almost white incandescence of overburning. They include the sound of the kiln, a deep, steady roar of combustion that is quiet when the fire is low and builds to a muffled, thrumming resonance when the burn is at its peak. They include the smell of the exhaust, which is clean and sharp when the limestone is calcining well, but becomes sulphurous and acrid if the coal is impure or the draft is insufficient. And they include the feel of the kiln wall under his palm, a language of temperature that he has been reading since he was a young apprentice, the heat penetrating the stonework in a slow wave that tells him exactly how far the burning zone has progressed and whether the charge is descending evenly. All of these signs are present now only in their latent, minimal forms, the banked embers giving off just enough heat to be felt, the draft a mere whisper, the wall cool but not cold. As the night proceeds and Peter adds fuel and stone to the charging mouth, these signs will intensify and multiply, and he will read them with the same quiet attention that he is applying now to the 2 stones in his hands. The ritual of holding the stones draws to its natural close. Peter lowers his arms, feeling the blood return to his fingers, and he places the lump of limestone back on its pile with a soft, solid click as it settles against its neighbors. He places the coal back on its heap, the black fragment disappearing into the dark mass, and he brushes his palms together, a light, habitual gesture that dislodges the worst of the dust. The willow basket still waits at his feet, its woven sides pale and dry, and the lantern still burns on its hook, and the river still murmurs its endless, quiet song. The long night of loading is about to commence, the alternation of fuel and stone that will fill the kiln's throat and bring the dormant fire back to full life. Peter bends down, picks up the basket by its iron-rimmed edge, and turns toward the coal pile, his body moving with the same slow, deliberate economy that will carry him through the hours until dawn. He has understood the materials, and now he will begin the work of uniting them in the dark, vertical shaft, where stone and fire will perform their ancient, alchemical dance. The first basket of the night is always a moment of quiet significance, though Peter would never think of it in such terms. It is simply the point at which the waiting ends and the work begins. The transition from preparation to action, marked by nothing more dramatic than the scrape of the willow basket against the stone platform as he lifts it and carries it toward the dark pile of coal. His boots make their soft, regular sound on the swept stone, and the lantern light moves with him, the pool of yellow illumination shifting across the platform so that the coal pile seems to emerge from the darkness as he approaches, its jagged contours sharpening into visibility. He sets the basket down at the edge of the pile, its flat bottom making a faint, hollow sound on the stone, and he kneels beside it, his canvas coat spreading around him and his leather-wrapped hands already reaching for the first pieces of fuel. The coal is cold and faintly damp from its time in the open air, though the dampness is only superficial, a thin film of moisture that will evaporate instantly when it meets the heat of the kiln. Peter selects the pieces with a practiced eye, choosing those that are roughly the size of his fist, not so large that they will bridge and create air pockets in the kiln shaft, and not so small that they will pack too densely and choke the draft. His fingers close around the angular fragments, feeling their glassy edges bite into the worn leather, and he lifts them one by one into the basket with a steady, unhurried rhythm. The sound of the coal settling into the willow container is a soft clatter and shuffle, a noise that is halfway between the clink of stones and the rustle of dry leaves, and it repeats with each new piece that he adds. The basket fills gradually, the black fragments building up in layers, their glossy surfaces catching the lamplight in brief, oily flashes that shift and disappear as the angle changes. When the basket is full enough, not heaped, but holding a comfortable load of perhaps 30 pounds, Peter rises from his kneeling position with the same deliberate economy that governs all his movements. He straightens his knees first, then his back, feeling the familiar pull of the weight in his arms, and he turns toward the kiln, carrying the basket before him with both hands gripping the reinforced rim. The distance from the coal pile to the charging mouth is no more than 20 paces, a short walk that he will make so many times tonight that it will become automatic, his feet finding the same path each time without conscious direction. As he walks, the coal shifts slightly in the basket, small fragments settling and rubbing together, and the weight sways with his stride, a gentle, rhythmic motion that his body compensates for without thought. The charging mouth of the kiln waits like a dark well, its circular opening a perfect absence of light. And as Peter approaches, he can feel the faint residual warmth that breathes up from the shaft, a ghost of the banked embers far below. He positions himself at the edge of the opening, his boots finding the familiar placement on either side, and he tips the basket forward with a smooth, controlled motion. The coal slides out in a dark rush, the pieces tumbling over the stone rim and disappearing into the vertical darkness, with a sound that is not a crash, but a soft, sliding rustle, a gentle waterfall of black fragments descending through the shaft to land on the bed of warm embers at the bottom. The sound lasts for only a few seconds, a brief cascade that ends in a muffled settling, and then the silence returns, broken only by the river and the lantern's quiet hiss. Peter lowers the now empty basket, his arms feeling the sudden lightness, and he pauses to listen to the kiln, his head tilted slightly, his attention focused on the deep interior darkness. The embers at the base of the kiln receive the fresh coal with a faint, almost inaudible sizzle, the surface moisture flashing into steam, and after a moment, the deep orange glow from below seems to pulse very slightly, a response to the new fuel that has landed on the hotbed. Peter watches for this response, and when he sees it, the faintest imaginable brightening of the dim glow that reflects off the lower firebrick, he nods once to himself, a tiny, private gesture of confirmation. The coal has landed well, the draft is still open, and the embers are alive enough to begin the slow process of igniting the first layer. He does not hurry to add more. The rhythm of the work demands patience at every stage, and the coal bed must be built up in careful increments, each layer allowed to catch and begin burning before the next is added. He returns the basket to the coal pile, walking with the same measured pace, and he kneels again, filling it with the same careful selection of fragments, the shapes and sizes chosen to ensure an even bed. The second basket is carried to the kiln mouth and tipped in exactly the same way, the coal sliding into the darkness, the soft rustle of its descent, the pause to listen and watch for the kiln's response. The glow at the base seems very slightly brighter now, a deepening of the orange that spreads across the floor of the drawer tunnel, and the faint warmth that rises past Peter's face as he leans over the charging mouth is a degree or two warmer than before. The transformation has already begun, the long, slow awakening of the dormant fire, though it will be hours before the kiln reaches its full operating temperature. A third basket follows the second, and then a fourth, each one carried with the same steady economy of motion, the same brief pause at the charging mouth to tip and listen. Peter is building the foundation layer of fuel, the bed that will support and ignite all the limestone and coal that will be added above it. This bed must be of a precise thickness, deep enough to provide a sustained, even burn, but not so deep that it smothers the embers or blocks the upward passage of air. He knows the correct depth not by measurement, but by the accumulated intuition of thousands of similar nights. And he can feel, when the bed is approaching its proper state, the increased weight of the descending coal as it lands on the growing pile, the way the sound of the settling fragments changes from a soft, individual clatter to a denser, more muffled impact, and the gradual brightening of the glow below, which now casts a faint but distinct orange light across the draw-hole arch. After the fourth basket, Peter sets down the empty carrier and reaches for his long iron bar, the same bar he carried down from the moor and probed the kiln with earlier. He slides the bar carefully through the charging mouth, its length descending into the darkness until the blunt end comes to rest on the surface of the new coal bed. He probes the bed gently, moving the bar in the slow, systematic pattern, feeling for any unevenness, any thin spots or thick accumulations that would cause the fire to burn irregularly. The bar transmits the texture of the fuel bed through its iron length, a uniform, slightly springy resistance that tells him the coal is lying in a level, loosely packed layer. He gives the bar a single gentle tamp, pressing down on the center of the bed to ensure it is settled, and then he withdraws it, satisfied. The foundation is sound. With the coal bed established, Peter now enters the rhythm that will define the rest of the night, the slow, patient alternation of fuel and stone that builds the kiln charge layer by layer. But the coal layer is not yet complete. It requires one more element, a thin scattering of selected small pieces that will act as kindling for the limestone layer to come. He takes up the basket once more and fills it with a special selection from the coal pile, the smallest, most fragmented pieces, some no larger than walnuts, that will ignite quickly and transfer their heat to the stone above with particular efficiency. This final scattering is carried to the kiln and tipped in a more controlled fashion, Peter shaking the basket gently from side to side as he pours so that the small fragments spread out evenly across the bed rather than accumulating in a single pile. The tiny pieces of coal make a finer, faster sound as they descend, a pattering that is almost like rain, and when they land, the glow from below seems to flicker for just a moment, a sign that the kindling layer has reached the hot embers and is beginning to catch. Peter stands at the charging mouth for a longer moment now, his hands resting on the worn stone rim, his body still and his attention fully focused on the kiln below. The glow from the draw hole has brightened perceptibly since he began loading, deepening from the faint, barely visible orange of banked embers to a steadier, stronger color that illuminates the lower portion of the fire brick lining and casts a dim, warm light across the floor of the draw tunnel. The warmth rising through the charging mouth is now distinct, a steady current of heated air that carries the clean, slightly sharp smell of coal smoke beginning to develop, the first true sign of active combustion. The draft is pulling well, the air entering through the draw hole and flowing upward through the fuel bed, feeding the awakening fire with a gentle, continuous supply of oxygen. The kiln is no longer dormant, it is stirring, the long sleep of the banked embers giving way to the first stages of full wakefulness. The river continues its endless murmur in the darkness below, and the stars continue their slow procession overhead, and the lantern burns steadily on its hook, its small flame perfectly constant. Peter remains motionless for a full minute, perhaps two, his eyes fixed on the glow below, his ears attuned to the subtle sounds of the kiln, the quiet, deep-down hiss of the coal beginning to burn in earnest, the soft creak of the fire brick expanding slightly as the temperature rises, and the steady, almost imperceptible thrum of the draft pulling air through the tunnel. These sounds are the kiln's voice, and Peter understands them as clearly as if they were words. The burn is progressing exactly as it should, neither too fast nor too slow, and the coal bed is established and burning with the even, settled character that the limestone requires. He turns from the charging mouth at last, the next stage of the work clear in his mind, and he walks toward the limestone pile, his canvas coat rustling softly with his movement, and his boots making their familiar sound on the swept stone. The empty basket swings lightly from his hand, its purpose for the coal now complete for the moment, and as he reaches the pale, bulky heap of limestone, he sets it down and prepares to begin the second part of the cycle, the loading of the stone that will rest upon the burning fuel and begin its own slow transformation. The night is still young, the stars are still bright, and the long, methodical labor of the lime burner continues without haste, without drama, as steady and inevitable as the river that flows through the dark gorge below. The limestone pile waits in its pale, silent mass at the edge of the platform, and as Peter approaches it, the lantern light slides across the broken surfaces of the rock, picking out the tiny sparkles of calcite crystals and the faint, ghostly impressions of ancient shells. He sets the empty willow basket down beside the heap, the woven sides rasping softly against the stone, and he takes up the shovel that leans against the nearby tool rest, its blade worn thin and bright from years of scraping against limestone. The shovel is a simple tool, a broad, slightly curved iron blade set on a long ash handle smoothed by countless hands, and it makes a harder, sharper sound than the rake when it bites into the stone pile, a crisp, ringing scrape that echoes briefly off the cliff wall before being swallowed by the gorge's darkness. Peter works the shovel into the base of the pile with a practiced motion, sliding the blade under the loose chunks of limestone and levering them upward, feeling the weight settle onto the iron. He lifts the loaded shovel steadily, his arms taking the strain with the easy familiarity of long habit, and he tips the contents into the waiting basket. The limestone tumbles into the willow container with a clatter that is louder and more distinct than the softer rustle of the coal, each piece striking the woven sides and the stones already below with a series of individual clicks and knocks that blend into a brief, percussive chorus. The sound is satisfying in its solidity, the sound of real weight being gathered, and it marks the shift from the dark fuel to the pale stone that is the true object of the lime burner's labor. He fills the basket with the same careful attention that he gave to the coal, selecting pieces that are roughly uniform in size, avoiding the very largest chunks that might bridge across the kiln shaft and the very smallest fragments that would pack too tightly and restrict the flow of gases. The ideal piece is about the size of a man's two fists together, large enough to leave voids between its neighbors, yet small enough to settle evenly as the charge descends. Peter's eyes move across the pile as he works, and his hands follow his eyes, picking up a lump here, discarding one there, building the basket's load with an automatic, wordless judgment that has become as natural as breathing. The limestone is cool and dense, its weight a solid pull on his arms each time he adds another piece, and the basket fills more slowly than it did with the lighter coal, each addition making a noticeable difference to the heft of the load. When the basket is full, the limestone pieces rising in a small, irregular mound above the iron rim, Peter straightens and takes up the weight, his hands gripping the reinforced edge on either side. The load is heavier than the coal baskets, perhaps 40 pounds or a little more, and he feels the pull across his shoulders and down his spine, a familiar tension that his body has long since adapted to. He carries the basket toward the kiln with the same measured 20-pace walk, his boots sounding on the stone platform, his canvas coat shifting with his stride, and the load swaying gently with the rhythm of his movement. The limestone pieces rub against each other inside the basket, making a soft, gritty sound, and the weight requires a slightly different balance, a more upright carriage, but Peter adjusts to it without thought, his body knowing what his mind does not need to direct. At the charging mouth he positions himself carefully, his boots finding the same placement as before, and he pauses for a moment, looking down into the dark shaft where the coal bed now glows with a steady, deep orange warmth that has grown perceptibly stronger since the last fuel was added. The heat rising through the opening is more pronounced now, a warm current that brushes his face and carries the clean, sharp smell of burning coal and the first faint mineral tang of heated limestone. He tips the basket forward in a smooth, controlled motion, and the limestone slides out in a pale grey cascade, the stones tumbling over the rim and falling through the darkness, their descent marked by a series of clattering impacts that is louder and more irregular than the coal's soft rustle. The limestone strikes the coal bed below with a succession of individual thuds and knocks, each piece landing and settling, and the sound lasts longer than it did for the fuel, a brief stony rainfall that echoes at the shaft and fades into the deeper, steadier hiss of the fire. Peter listens to the settling of the stone with his head tilted, his attention focused on the quality of the sound, reading from it the way the limestone has distributed itself across the coal bed. A uniform, evenly spread sound means the stones have landed in a good level layer. A concentrated, heavier thump in one spot would indicate a pile-up that needs to be corrected. The sound he hears is good, a general, distributed rattling that fades evenly, and he nods once, the tiny gesture of confirmation that marks each successful step. He lowers the empty basket and rests it on the rim of the charging mouth for a moment, his eyes still on the darkness below, and he watches the faint shimmer of heat that now rises visibly from the opening, a transparent distortion of the air that makes the stars beyond seem to waver ever so slightly. The limestone layer that now rests on the coal bed is the first to feel the full force of the rising fire, and its position is critical to the success of the entire burn. This layer will be heated from below by the burning fuel and from above by the hot gases that pass through it, and it must be thick enough to absorb and distribute that heat evenly, but not so thick that the lower portion overcalcines before the upper portion is even warmed. Peter has learned the correct thickness through years of observation, through the patient trial and error that is the only true teacher in this trade, and he knows that the first stone layer should be slightly thicker than the ones that will be added later. A generous bed of limestone that will be added later. A generous bed of limestone that will act as a buffer between the raw fire and the alternating layers above. He has delivered one full basket, but the layer requires more, and so he turns from the kiln and walks back to the limestone pile, the empty basket swinging from his hand. The second basket is filled in the same way, the shovel biting into the stone heap, the clatter of limestone tumbling into the willow container, the careful selection of pieces, and the slow, steady carry back to the charging mouth. The rhythm of the work is beginning to establish itself, a quiet, repeating cycle that will continue through the dark hours: gather, carry, tip, listen, return. Each repetition is identical in its outline, yet subtly different in its details. The weight of the basket varying slightly, the sound of the stones changing as the pile is drawn down, the warmth from the kiln increasing by tiny increments. Peter does not count the repetitions. He feels the progress of the work in his body, in the growing heat on his face, in the slow fatigue that will not become apparent for hours yet, and in the gradual change of the sounds from the kiln below. After the second basket of limestone has been tipped into the shaft, Peter sets down the empty container and reaches for the wooden rake that leans against the kiln wall. The rake has a long handle of ash, dark with age and soot, and a head set with sturdy wooden tines that have been worn to a smooth, rounded finish by the constant abrasion of stone. He slides the rake carefully through the charging mouth, its handle angling down into the darkness, and he uses the tines to feel the surface of the limestone layer, probing gently for any unevenness. The rake transmits the texture of the stone bed up through the handle, a loose, irregular surface of individual lumps that shift slightly under the pressure of the tines. Peter works the rake in a slow, sweeping motion, drawing it across the surface of the limestone from one side to the other, smoothing out any high spots and filling in any hollows, ensuring that the layer is as level as the coal bed below it. The importance of this leveling cannot be overstated. The kiln charge that is not level will descend unevenly as the material below calcines and shrinks, the higher side lagging behind and creating a tilted, unstable column that can jam or channel the hot gases in destructive ways. An uneven charge is also harder to manage, requiring constant correction with the iron bar, and it can lead to patches of stone that are overburned and patches that emerge raw and useless. Peter's rake, moving in its slow, patient arcs, is the instrument that prevents all of these problems, and he wields it with the same quiet care that a gardener gives to a fine seed bed. The tines scrape across the limestone with a soft, gritty sound, a sound that is halfway between grinding and brushing, and the stones shift into new positions, finding the stable interlocking arrangement that will carry them smoothly down through the kiln's throat. When the rake tells him that the surface is even, Peter withdraws it and leans it back against the kiln wall. Its work done for the moment. He returns to the limestone pile and fills the third basket, carrying it to the charging mouth and tipping it in with the same measured, unhurried motion. This third basket completes the initial stone layer, building it up to the thickness that Peter knows by feel is correct, a depth of perhaps 2 feet of limestone resting on the fuel bed below. The sound of the third basket's descent is different from the first two, the stones landing on the limestone already in place rather than on the coal, and the resulting clatter is duller, more solid, the sound of stone striking stone. It fades quickly, swallowed by the growing warmth and the steady, deep-down hiss of the fire. With the first stone layer complete, Peter pauses again, leaning the iron bar against his hip and resting his hands on the warm rim of the charging mouth. The heat rising from the shaft is now a steady, gentle flow, warm enough that he can feel it on his face and hands even from a foot above the opening, and the glow from the draw hole at the base has brightened to a distinct, deep orange that illuminates the lower portion of the kiln's interior with a dim but steady light. The fire is no longer merely awakening. It is fully awake, the coal bed burning with a settled, even combustion that consumes the fuel at a measured rate, and the heat is beginning its slow work on the limestone above. The first faint wisps of smoke, pale and almost invisible, drift from the charging mouth, rising into the cold night air and dispersing quickly. Their smell a clean, mineral sharpness that is the signature of the burn proceeding correctly. Peter looks up from the kiln mouth, his gaze rising to the dark cliff wall and the stars beyond, and he takes a long, slow breath, feeling the cold air mix with the warm in his lungs. The night is still quiet, the river's murmur unchanged, the stars in their same slow wheel, and the gorge holds its peace around him like a vast dark blanket. He is alone, with the kiln and the materials, the only living being awake in this deep, stony fold of the earth. And the solitude is not lonely, but complete. A perfect, undemanding companionship of stone and fire and water. He rests for a full minute, perhaps two, his body still and his mind empty, allowing the burn to establish itself before he begins the next cycle of the night's long, slow work. The first layer of stone is in place, and the transformation has begun. The fire hisses softly at the base of the kiln, a steady, deep-down whisper that has become as constant as the river's murmur, and the sound of the river gurgles through the dark reeds far below, a liquid counterpoint to the dry, hot voice of the combustion. The air around the charging platform smells of river mist and old stone, and now increasingly of the clean, sharp scent of heated limestone, a mineral fragrance that cuts through the cooler, damper smells of the gorge with a pleasant, clarifying presence. The lantern burns on its hook, its flame perfectly steady inside the horn casing, and the pool of yellow light it casts across the platform has become the fixed center of Peter's world, the illuminated stage on which the long, slow dance of loading will continue until dawn. He has completed the first full cycle, the foundation bed of coal and the initial thick layer of limestone, and now, with the kiln awake and the draft pulling well, he settles into the rhythm that will carry him through the heart of the night, the endless, soothing repetition of fuel and stone, alternating in a pattern as old as the draw kiln itself. The routine begins again with the coal, for every layer of limestone must rest on a layer of fuel, and the fire must be fed in increments, never all at once. Peter takes up the empty willow basket, its woven sides now lightly dusted with both black coal powder and pale limestone grit, and he walks the 20 paces to the dark pile at the edge of the platform. His steps are unhurried, his breath steady, and the faint fatigue that will accumulate over the hours is not yet noticeable, masked by the quiet engagement of his body in a task it knows so well. He kneels beside the coal pile, the canvas coat spreading around him on the stone, and his leather-wrapped hands reach for the fuel with the same selective care, picking out the fist-sized, glossy fragments that will burn evenly and steadily. The coal clicks and rustles as he gathers it, the pieces settling into the basket in their dark, angular arrangement, and the lantern light catches the oily sheen of their fractured surfaces, picking out highlights that shift and vanish as the basket fills. When the basket holds its 30 pounds of fuel, Peter rises and carries it to the charging mouth. The 20 paces feeling shorter now, more automatic, the path already beginning to etch itself into the night's pattern. He tips the coal into the dark shaft, watching the black fragments tumble down onto the limestone layer below, and this time the sound of their descent is different, a softer, more muffled rustle as the fuel lands not on a solid bed of glowing embers, but on the uneven, stony surface of the limestone charge. The coal spreads across the stone, finding the hollows and crevices between the larger lumps, and Peter uses the long iron bar to gently nudge the pieces into a more even distribution, the blunt end probing through the charging mouth with a series of soft, scraping touches. The bar transmits the feeling of the coal settling, the small shifts and slides as the fragments find their places, and when the surface feels uniform, He withdraws the bar and returns to the pile for the next basket. The second basket of coal follows the first, carried and tipped with the same steady, unvarying motions. The sound of the descent identical, the pause to probe and level identical, the whole sequence a perfect copy of what has come before. And yet there is a subtle progression hidden within the repetition, for each new layer of fuel adds to the total mass of the charge, and the fire, burning upward through the column, encounters slightly different conditions as it rises. The coal that Peter is adding now will not ignite immediately. It must first descend through the preheating zone, absorbing warmth from the hot gases that flow past it, gradually drying and then beginning to release its volatile components before it reaches the temperature at which the carbon itself will burn. This descent will take hours, the fuel moving downward at the slow, invisible pace of the entire charge, and so Peter is loading tonight for a fire that will reach its peak sometime tomorrow, a fire that he will never see because his shift will have ended and another man will be standing in his place. The work is a relay, a continuous passing of the task from one pair of hands to the next, and Peter is simply the keeper of the flame for this particular segment of the night. With the coal layer established, Peter returns the basket to its resting place and walks to the limestone pile, his body shifting into the heavier work of loading the stone. The shovel bites into the pale heap with its crisp, ringing scrape, and the limestone chunks tumble into the basket with their louder, more percussive clatter, the sound of real weight being gathered. He fills the basket, carries it, tips it into the charging mouth and listens to the stones landing on the fresh fuel below, the thuds and knocks echoing up the shaft. Then the rake, the patient wooden rake, slides down into the darkness to smooth the new surface, its tines drawing across the rough stone with a soft, grinding sound that has become a familiar part of the night's quiet music. The rake is withdrawn, the basket is refilled, and the sequence repeats. Fill, carry, tip, level, fill again. The limestone layer grows in increments, each basket adding its contribution to the column, and Peter works through the cycle with the same gentle, hypnotic regularity, his body moving through the tasks while his mind drifts into a calm, empty state that is halfway between waking and sleep. The physical sensations of the work are a constant, grounding presence that keeps him anchored in the moment. The rough grip of the basket's woven rim against his leather-wrapped fingers, the solid bite of the shovel into the stone pile, the pull of the weight across his shoulders and down his back as he carries the loaded basket, the warm breath of the kiln on his face as he tips the contents into the shaft, the smooth slide of the rake handle through his hands, the vibration of the tines scraping across the stone surface below. These sensations repeat in endless variation, each one slightly different, yet essentially the tanes, bethilds the night with oustic. The sounds, too, form a repeating tapestry, the scrape of the shovel, the clatter of limestone, the soft rustle of coal, the thud of settling stones, the scrape of the rake, the hiss of the fire, the murmur of the river. There are no other sounds, no interruptions, no variations beyond the tiny, incremental changes in the kiln's voice as it heats further, its deep-down hiss gradually deepening into a steadier, more resonant note that speaks of a fire growing in strength. The alternation of fuel and stone settles into a quiet, trance-like rhythm that seems to slow time itself, stretching the hours into a long, seamless expanse of gentle labor. Peter does not count the layers. He feels the height of the charge by the changing angle of the rake as he probes the surface, by the way the heat from the charging mouth shifts from a warm breath to a steadier, more insistent flow, and by the gradual, almost imperceptible brightening of the glow that reflects from the lower portion of the kiln's interior. The charge is rising inside the shaft, the column of stone and fuel building upward toward the mouth, and the pile of limestone on the platform is slowly diminishing while the coal heap shrinks at a corresponding pace. This is the only visible measure of progress, the gradual transfer of material from the platform to the kiln, a slow, silent migration that will continue until the shaft is full and the charge is ready to burn through the coming day. As the night deepens, the cold of the gorge begins to assert itself more strongly, the temperature dropping by small, steady increments that Peter feels on the exposed skin of his face and the back of his neck. But the kiln is now radiating a gentle, diffused warmth from its stone walls, and the area immediately around the charging platform has become a small island of relative comfort in the vast, cold darkness. When Peter moves away from the kiln to gather more material, he feels the chill settle onto his shoulders and the cold air bite at his cheeks. And then, as he returns to the charging mouth and leans over the warm opening, the heat washes over him again. A pleasant, enveloping sensation that soothes the cold away. This alternation of warm and cool, repeated with every trip to the piles and back, becomes another layer of the rhythm, a slow thermal pulse that matches the rhythm of his steps and the rhythm of his breathing. The river below maintains its endless soothing murmur, a sound so steady and so deeply familiar that it has faded into the background of Peter's awareness, a constant presence that he no longer notices consciously, but that would be deeply unsettling if it were to stop. The stars overhead continue their slow wheel, the constellations shifting by degrees, and Peter occasionally glances up to read the sky's clock, noting the position of the bright planets and the angle of the Great Bear. The night is progressing as it should, the hours passing in the quiet, wordless way they always do, and he feels no impatience, no desire for the dawn to come faster. The work fills the time completely, leaving no room for restlessness, and the steady repetition of the loading cycle has a soothing effect on the mind, smoothing away the edges of thought until only the gentle, present moment remains. After several more cycles of coal and limestone, the charge inside the kiln has risen significantly. The top of the stone bed now only a few feet below the charging mouth, and Peter adjusts his technique accordingly. The rake no longer needs to probe so deeply into the shaft, and the iron bar, which he uses now to nudge the coals into place, has a shorter reach, its movements more precise and delicate as the surface of the charge approaches the level of the platform. The heat rising from the mouth is stronger now, a steady, warm current that makes the air above the opening shimmer visibly, and when Peter leans over to tip a basket, the warmth on his face is almost hot, a reminder of the intense fire that is burning only a short distance below. The kiln wall, when he places his palm against it, is noticeably warm to the touch, the heat penetrating through the thick stonework and radiating outward into the cold night air. And this warmth is the most tangible sign of the burn's progress, a bodily confirmation that the work is proceeding exactly as it should. The lantern on its hook has burned steadily through all these hours, its small reservoir of fish oil lasting with the frugal efficiency of a well-made lamp, and Peter pauses occasionally to check the wick and adjust the flame, a tiny maintenance task that takes only a moment before he returns to the main rhythm. The lamp's glow, which seemed so bright when he first hung it in the dark platform, now seems merely sufficient, a small circle of yellow light in the immense darkness of the gorge, and Peter's eyes have adapted so completely to the night that he can see the faint outlines of the cliff walls and the distant glimmer of starlight on the river without needing to leave the illuminated circle. The darkness beyond the platform is no longer an absence but a presence, a deep, velvety substance that surrounds and contains the small, bright stage of his labor, and he feels at home in it, as much a part of the night as the rocks and the water and the slow-burning kiln. The layers of coal and limestone have built up inside the shaft in alternating bands, a striped column of dark fuel and pale stone that descends through the preheating zone, the calcining zone, and the cooling zone in a continuous, gradual progression. Peter cannot see these bands, but he knows them intimately, can visualize them in his mind's eye as clearly as if the kiln were made of glass. The dark seam of fresh coal at the top, just below the surface of the charge, absorbing warmth from the gases that flow past it. The grey layer of limestone beneath, still cool and unchanged. Further down, the coal beginning to smoke and smoulder as it enters the hotter region, the clawed region, the crumbly, radiant-intense heat of days of castination. And at the very bottom, this vertical map of temperature and chemistry lives in his imagination, guiding his hands as he builds each new layer with the precise thickness and evenness that the process demands. The physical repetition of the work has now become so deeply ingrained that Peter's body performs the tasks almost without conscious direction, his hands reaching for the basket, his feet carrying him to the piles, his arms lifting and tipping, while his mind floats in a calm, detached state that is neither fully alert nor fully asleep. It is a state that experienced craftsmen know well, a kind of waking meditation in which the body continues its learned motions while the conscious mind rests, observing without intervening a passenger in the skilled vehicle of the body. In this state, the hours pass with a strange elastic quality, sometimes feeling long and stretched, sometimes compressing so that a whole cycle of loading seems to have taken no time at all. The night flows around Peter like the river flows around its stones, a smooth, continuous movement that carries him gently toward the dawn. Occasionally, a tiny variation breaks the rhythm, a piece of coal that is oddly shaped and requires a specific placement, a lump of limestone that is too large and must be set aside for breaking later, a slight adjustment of the rake to correct a minor unevenness in the stone bed. These small variations are not interruptions, but part of the rhythm itself, the natural, organic irregularity of working with natural materials that refuse to be perfectly uniform. Peter deals with each one calmly, his hands making the necessary adjustment, his mind barely registering the deviation before the steady, repeating cycle resumes. The work is a conversation between the lime burner and the materials sometimes have their own quiet suggestions, their own small demands, which Peter meets with the same patient, unhurried attention that he gives to everything else. The scent of the night has changed as the burn has progressed. The cool, damp smell of river mist and wet stone, now overlaid with the warmer, sharper aromas of the kiln, the clean, mineral scent of heated limestone, the faint, tarry tang of coal smoke, and the dry, slightly sweet smell of calcium oxide that rises from the lower draw hole. These smells mingle in the still air of the platform, creating a complex, layered perfume that is unique to this place and this moment. A fragrance that Peter has known for 30 years and that he would recognize instantly anywhere in the world. It is the smell of his trade, the smell of transformation, and it fills his nostrils with each slow, even breath. A constant, comforting presence that is as much a part of the night as the darkness and the stars. The pile of limestone on the platform has shrunk considerably, the pale heap now only half its original size, and the coal pile has diminished at the same steady rate, the dark fragments being carried away basket by basket and tipped into the hungry mouth of the kiln. The platform itself, which was swept clean at the start of the night, has acquired a fresh dusting of pale powder and dark specks, the inevitable debris of the loading process, but Peter will sweep it again before his shift ends, leaving the workspace tidy for the man who will relieve him. For now, the dust is simply a sign of progress, a visual record of the many trips he has made between the piles and the kiln, and he pays it no attention, his focus remaining on the rhythm that carries him through the darkness. The night continues, deep and quiet and seemingly endless, and Peter continues with it, a solitary figure in the small circle of lamplight, moving with the slow, patient grace of a man who has found his place in the world and asks for nothing more than to fill it well. The kiln hums with its deep, steady fire, the river murmurs its ancient song, and the layers of stone and fuel build upward toward the charging mouth, one basket at a time, in the gentle, hypnotic repetition that is the heart of the lime burner's night. As the night deepens and the charge inside the kiln grows heavier with each alternating layer, Peter reaches a point in his shift when the rhythm pauses of its own accord, a natural stopping place dictated not by fatigue, but by the kiln itself. He has just tipped a basket of limestone into the charging mouth and leveled the new surface with the wooden rake, and now he steps back from the warm stone rim, straightening his back and letting the rake handle rest against his shoulder like a staff. His canvas coat settles around him with a soft, whispering sound, and his boots find a still spot on the swept stone platform where the lantern light falls in a steady golden pool. The rake handle, worn smooth by the grip of many hands over many nights, feels warm where his leather-wrapped fingers have held it, and he leans on it gently, allowing his weight to shift onto the sturdy ash shaft while his eyes turn toward the dark mouth of the kiln and the faint, shimmering space above it. The first thing he notices, and he notices it with the quiet satisfaction of a man reading familiar signs, is the way the air above the charging mouth has begun to dance. A faint shimmer of heat now rises from the opening in a continuous transparent current, a distortion of the night air that makes the stars behind it seem to waver and tremble, as if they were lights seen through moving water. This heat haze has been building gradually throughout the earlier hours, but now it has reached a distinct visible presence, a soft, wavering column that rises straight up from the shaft and dissipates into the cold darkness above. The shimmer is colorless, but it has a quality, a kind of liquid transparency that catches the faintest glint of starlight and refracts it into tiny momentary sparkles that come and go at the edge of vision. Peter watches this gentle, silent phenomenon with the same calm attention that a sailor might watch the steady flame of a lighthouse, reading in its behavior the state of the fire far below. A steady, unwavering shimmer means the burn is even and the draft is pulling well. A flickering, erratic shimmer would indicate turbulence or an obstruction in the shaft. Tonight, the shimmer rises straight and true, a transparent banner of heat that tells him the kiln is breathing perfectly. The smell of the gorge has changed too, and Peter draws a slow, deep breath through his nose, tasting the new balance of scents that now fills the air around the platform. When he first arrived in the early night, the dominant smell was the cool, damp fragrance of river mist and wet limestone, a clean, cold scent that spoke of water and shadow and the deep chill of the gorge. That coolness is still present, especially when he turns his face toward the unseen river below, but it has now been joined and gradually overtaken by the warmer, sharper aromas of the burning kiln. The clean mineral scent of heated limestone is the strongest of these new notes, a dry, almost chalky fragrance that fills the sinuses with a pleasant, clarifying sharpness. It is the smell of calcium carbonate on the very edge of transformation, the ancient sea being driven from the stone in invisible wisps. Beneath this mineral scent there is the faint, tarry tang of coal smoke, a darker, richer aroma that speaks of the fuel burning steadily in the shaft, and beneath that, rising from the lower draw hole, there is the peculiar dry sweetness of quicklime that has already been calcined and now waits in the cooling zone, a smell that is almost like hot, clean dust, if dust could be said to have a scent. All of these smells mingle together in the still air, creating a layered, complex perfume that is unique to this stage of the burn, and Peter breathes it in with the same quiet appreciation that another man might give to a fine wine. The kiln wall, which was cool to the touch when he first arrived, now radiates a gentle, settled heat that Peter can feel even without placing his hand against it. The warmth emanates from the curving stonework in a steady, invisible wave, pushing back the cold of the night and creating a small zone of comfort around the charging platform. When he stands close to the wall, as he does now, the heat reaches his face and his chest through his canvas coat. A pleasant, diffused sensation that is neither too hot nor too cool, the exact temperature of a sun-warmed rock on a mild afternoon. The stonework itself is now noticeably warm, and Peter, following an impulse that is both practical and deeply habitual, removes the leather wrapping from his right hand, tucking it into his belt for a moment. He places his bare palm flat against the outer stones of the kiln, pressing his skin against the rough, weathered surface and holding it there in perfect stillness. The heat that flows into his hand is a language he has been reading for more than 30 years, a language of degrees that tells him precisely how far the burning zone has progressed and how evenly the fire is spreading through the charge. The temperature he feels now is warm but not hot, a deep, steady heat that has penetrated through the thick fire brick lining and the outer stonework, indicating that the fire is fully established throughout the lower portion of the charge and that the limestone is calcining at exactly the right pace. If the wall were too hot, it would mean the fire was burning too fiercely, consuming the fuel too fast and risking damage to the kiln lining. If it were too cool, it would mean the draft was insufficient or the coal was not igniting properly. The warmth he feels now is the perfect middle of the range, a condition that he describes to himself not in words but in the simple recognition of rightness, and he leaves his palm on the stone for a long moment, feeling the steady pulse of heat that is the kiln's slow heartbeat. When he removes his hand, the skin is faintly pink and tingling, and he flexes his fingers several times before drawing the leather wrapping back over his palm, tightening the laces with the same careful, automatic motions. The brief contact with the bare stone has grounded him in the physical reality of the kiln's condition, and he turns his attention next to the lower part of the structure, walking the short distance to the edge of the platform where he can look down toward the draw hole. The arched opening at the base of the kiln, which earlier in the night showed only the faintest possible suggestion of orange, now glows with a deep, steady light that illuminates the floor of the draw tunnel and casts a warm, dim radiance onto the dark ground in front of the arch. The orange has deepened and strengthened over the hours, brightening almost imperceptibly with each new layer of fuel that has descended into the combustion zone. And Peter kneels down on one knee to look more closely at the quality of the glow. It is a settled, even light, not the fierce, flickering glare of a rapid fire, but the calm, steady emission of a deep bed of embers burning with perfect consistency. He can see the individual shapes of the lower fire bricks now, their edges defined by the warm light, and he can see the faint, moving shadows that ripple across the tunnel floor as the hot gases stir the ember bed in a slow, tidal rhythm. The draw hole itself is breathing, and Peter can feel the cool night air being drawn into the tunnel in a gentle, continuous flow, feeding the fire with the oxygen it needs to sustain its steady combustion. He holds his bare hand near the opening, the one he has not yet rewrapped, and he feels the faint but distinct movement of air against his skin, a cool current flowing inward that tells him the draft is pulling perfectly through the entire height of the kiln. The air enters here, passes upward through the cooling zone where it is warmed by the newly calcined quicklime, then enters the burning zone where it combines with the carbon of the coal, releasing the heat that drives the calcination. The hot gases then continue upward, preheating the fresh stone and fuel above, and finally escape through the charging mouth as the shimmering exhaust he has just been watching. This continuous circuit of air and heat and gas is the kiln's respiration, its slow, steady breathing that has now reached a state of perfect balance, and Peter, kneeling in the cold darkness before the glowing arch, feels the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the system is working exactly as it should. He rises from his knee, brushing the dust from his trousers with a few light swipes of his palm, and returns to the charging platform where the lantern still burns on its hook and the tools rest against the warm kiln wall. Standing at the center of the platform, he turns in a slow circle, his eyes moving across the scene that has become as familiar to him as his own cottage. The dark, diminishing piles of coal and limestone at the edge of the platform, the sweep of the cliff wall rising into the starry sky, the pale ribbon of the path winding up toward the moor, the vast, invisible presence of the gorge falling away below. And at the center of it all, the kiln itself, the massive curving structure in stone has now fully awakened, the kiln is no longer a passive object, a mere oven waiting to be filled. It has become an active presence, a living thing that breathes and hums and glows with its own internal fire, and Peter stands before it with the quiet reverence of a keeper who understands the trust that has been placed in his hands. The sound of the kiln has changed too, and this is perhaps the most telling sign of all. Earlier in the night, the only sound from the interior was the faint, distant hiss of the banked embers, a sound so quiet it could barely be heard above the river's murmur. Now that hiss has grown into a deep, steady, resonant note that fills the platform with a soft, continuous presence. A sound that is not loud, but is somehow very large, as if the entire mass of the kiln were humming with a low, sustained chord. It is the sound of air being drawn through the fire, of coal crackling gently as it burns, of limestone shifting and settling as it calcines and shrinks, and of the hot gases rushing upward through the narrow passages between the stones. This composite sound has a quality that is almost musical, a deep thrumming drone that vibrates faintly through the soles of Peter's boots and the palm of his hand when he touches the wall. It is the voice of the kiln in full operation, a voice that speaks of intense heat and slow transformation. And Peter listens to it with the same quiet satisfaction that he feels when he reads the wall's warmth or watches the shimmer above the mouth. The kiln is singing its steady song, and the song is a good one. He walks to the row of spy holes in the kiln's curving wall, those small observation ports that allow him to gauge the progress of the burn at different levels, and he removes the plug from the middle hole, the one located about halfway up the shaft. A shaft of warm, bright light escapes through the opening, golden orange and intense, and Peter squints slightly as he brings his eye close to the hole. The interior of the kiln at this level is a vision of quiet inferno. The limestone chunks are glowing with a deep, even red, their edges beginning to soften as the calcination proceeds, and the coal layers between them are burning with a bright, steady flame that wraps around the stones in slow, liquid movements. The entire mass is in motion, though the motion is too slow to see directly. A gradual subsidence and rearrangement as the lower portions of the charge give up their carbon dioxide and shrink, allowing the fresh material above to descend. The sight is one Peter has seen countless times, but it never loses its quiet fascination, the glimpse of a process that is almost geological in its slow, implacable power. He replaces the plug carefully, sealing the warmth and light back into the kiln, and he moves to the next spy hole, higher up, where the temperature is cooler and the stones are only beginning to take on the first faint blush of heat. Everything is progressing in exactly the right order, a gradient of temperature from the fierce heat of the burning zone to the mild warmth of the preheating zone, and Peter is satisfied. The charge inside the kiln is now fully engaged with the fire, every layer of coal and stone participating in the slow collective descent toward the burning zone. The fresh coal that Peter added in the early hours has now reached the region where the temperature is high enough to ignite it, and the deep orange glow from the draw hole is the proof of that ignition, a signal that the fuel is burning and the draft is pulling air perfectly through the entire column. The limestone that rests on those burning coals is beginning its chemical transformation, the calcium carbonate breaking down molecule by molecule, releasing its ancient store of carbon dioxide into the upward-flowing gases while the calcium oxide remains behind, glowing white-hot and slowly crumbling into the quicklime that will be raked out from the bottom. This is the purpose toward which all the night's slow labor has been directed, the moment when the kiln stops being a construction site and becomes a crucible, a vessel of change. And Peter, who has tended this same kiln through hundreds of such moments, stands in its warm presence and lets the quiet knowledge of it wash over him like the heat from the stone wall. The night around him is still dark, still cold, still full of stars and the sound of the river, but the small world of the charging platform has become a place apart, a warm, glowing island in the vast darkness of the gorge. The lantern on its hook seems almost redundant now, its small flame outshone by the deeper, grander light that comes from the kiln's interior and spills from the draw hole in the spy holes in the shimmering mouth. Peter, standing at the center of this small, warm world, allows himself a rare moment of complete stillness, his hands resting on the handle of the rake, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and deep. He is not resting because he is tired, though a gentle, pleasant fatigue has begun to settle into his limbs. He is resting because the kiln has reached a state of steady equilibrium that requires less active intervention and more quiet observation. The heavy work of loading will continue, but the pace can slacken slightly, the baskets coming at longer intervals, the pauses between them stretching out into long, calm spaces of watchful waiting. The kiln is now fully alive, a living, breathing presence that shares the night with him, and Peter acknowledges this fact with the same wordless respect that he would offer to a trusted companion. He straightens from his leaning posture, lifts the rake from its resting position, and walks back toward the limestone pile to resume the gentle rhythm of the loading. His body moving with the same slow, deliberate economy, his mind settled into the deep, quiet peace that comes from knowing that all is well, that the fire is burning true, and that the long night will continue to unfold in the same patient, unhurried way, until the long night will continue to unfold in the same patient, unhurried way, until the first pale light of dawn touches the high cliffs of the Gorges. Once the kiln achieves its balanced, steady state, a condition that Peter recognizes by the convergence of many small signs into a single, unmistakable sense of rightness, the nature of his work shifts from building to maintaining, and the pace of the night slows into an even deeper, more measured rhythm. The heavy lifting of the earlier hours, the steady succession of full baskets carried from the piles to the charging mouth, gives way to a more gradual, intermittent feeding, as if the kiln, now fully awake and burning with its own settled fire, requires only gentle encouragement rather than constant provision. Peter feels this shift in his body first, in the reduced frequency of the trips to the piles and the longer intervals of stillness that open up between each small addition of fuel or stone, and he adjusts his pace accordingly, settling into a watchful presence that is less about doing and more about being. He still carries the willow basket, but now he fills it only partially, a few lumps of coal or a few chunks of limestone at a time, enough to maintain the level of the charge near the top of the shaft, but not so much that the fresh material overwhelms the steady burn below. The full heaping baskets of the early night are no longer needed, because the kiln's appetite has become a slow, steady consumption rather than a rapid filling, and Peter, who has tended this same kiln through every phase of its operation, knows exactly how much to add and when to add it. The partial baskets are lighter, easier on his arms and back, and he carries them with the same measured step, but with a slightly different quality of attention. His focus now divided between the material in his hands and the subtle messages that the kiln is sending from its glowing interior. Between these smaller charges there are long periods of stillness, in which Peter simply stands by the kiln's mouth, resting his hands on the warm iron bar that he has propped against the stonework, and gazing into the shimmering darkness that rises from the shaft. His body settles into a comfortable, balanced posture, his weight evenly distributed on both feet. His shoulders relaxed under the canvas coat, and his breathing slow and deep, matching the deep, resonant hum of the kiln's fire. During these still intervals, he does not think in words or plan his next actions. He simply exists in the presence of the kiln, a quiet sentinel whose only duty is to watch and listen and feel. The warmth from the stone wall radiates against his side, the heat shimmer dances above the charging mouth, and the steady thrumming drone of the combustion fills the air with a sound that has become as constant and as comforting as a heartbeat. The kiln sighs as it draws in the night air through its lower arch, a deep, slow, rhythmic sound that is not quite a whoosh and not quite a moan, but something in between, a gentle respiration that speaks of the massive volume of air being pulled through the fire and up the shaft. This sighing breath is the most audible sign of the draft, the invisible current that sustains the entire process, and it has a quality of immense, patient power, as if the kiln were a great sleeping animal breathing in its dreams. Peter listens to each slow inhalation with a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that as long as the kiln breathes, the fire burns, and as long as the fire burns, the limestone transforms. The sighing is perfectly regular, a slow tidal rhythm that matches the deep, underlying pulse of the burn, and Peter has learned to synchronize his own breathing with it over the years, so that his body and the kiln seem to share the same calm, ancient tempo. Inside the shaft, a profound harmony has been established among all the elements of the charge. The fresh limestone and coal at the top are warming gradually, absorbing the heat that rises from below, their temperatures climbing in slow, even increments as they descend through the preheating zone. Further down, the coal is smoking and igniting, its volatile components driving off in invisible gases, while the fixed carbon begins to glow and burn with a steady, even flame that wraps around the limestone chunks in liquid, orange ribbons. The limestone itself, glowing with a deep red heat that brightens toward orange-white in the hottest zones, is undergoing its slow chemical transformation. The calcium carbonate molecules releasing their carbon dioxide and collapsing into the simpler, purer form of calcium oxide. And at the very bottom, in the cooling zone just above the draw hole, the finished quicklime rests in a bed of white-hot, crumbly lumps that are slowly giving up their heat to the incoming draft of air, preheating the combustion air before it reaches the fire. This entire vertical column of material, from the cool grey stone at the top to the glowing white lime at the bottom, is in a state of slow collective motion, descending at a rate that is almost imperceptible but absolutely constant. A gentle, geological subsidence that carries each piece through the full cycle of transformation. Peter can feel this motion even though he cannot see it directly. The charge settles under its own weight as the lower portions shrink and consolidate, and the surface of the stone bed at the top of the shaft slowly drops, a subsidence so gradual that it is only noticeable when he returns to the charging mouth after one of his long, still intervals and finds that the level has fallen by an inch or two. This settling is the signal that prompts him to take up the basket again, to add a few more lumps of coal followed by a few more chunks of limestone, restoring the charge to its proper height and ensuring that the column remains full and the draft remains stable. The addition of fresh material causes a small disturbance at the top of the bed, a slight shifting and rearrangement as the new stones find their places, and then the stillness returns, the surface of the charge subsiding once more into its slow, patient descent. The physical labor of the night is now mostly done, and what remains is a quiet vigilance that requires not strength but attention, a continuous, gentle awareness of the kiln's condition that fills the hours without exhausting the body. Peter walks slow circuits of the platform during his long intervals of stillness, his boots making their soft, familiar sound on the swept stone, and he checks each of the spy holes in turn, removing the plugs and peering into the glowing interior with the same calm, methodical care. The middle holes show him the bright, steady orange of the burning zone, the flames moving in slow, liquid undulations around the glowing limestone, while the lower holes reveal the white-hot bed of quicklime and the deep, cherry-red glow of the embers. The upper holes, closer to the charging mouth, show a cooler region where the stones are only just beginning to take on the first faint blush of heat. Their surface is dark but warming, the coal between them still black and dormant. This gradient of color from cool gray through dull red to bright orange and finally to white-hot is the visible map of the kiln's internal state, and Peter reads it with the same ease that a shepherd reads the weather in the sky. He checks the draw hole at the base several times during these quiet hours, kneeling before the low arch and peering into the glowing tunnel, feeling the steady current of cool air flowing past him into the kiln. The bed of embers at the bottom is deep and even, its surface rippling with slow liquid movements as the hot gases stir the coals, and the pile of finished quicklime that is accumulating behind the ember bed is growing by slow increments, a white, crumbly mass that radiates an intense, dry heat. Peter does not rake out any of this quicklime tonight. That is a task for the day shift, when the lime will be drawn and slaked and prepared for its journey to the farms and building sites and plasterers where it will fulfill its many purposes. His task is solely to maintain the burn, to feed the kiln with fuel and stone in the correct proportions, and to ensure that the fire never falters or overheats. The lantern on its hook has burned through most of its oil by now, and the flame inside the horn casing has begun to flicker occasionally, a sign that the reservoir is running low. Peter notices this during one of his slow circuits, and he pauses to refill the lamp from the small oil flask he carries in his coat pocket, a task that takes only a moment, but that provides a small, satisfying break in the long stillness. The fresh oil soaks into the wick and the flame steadies, brightening slightly, and the circle of yellow light on the platform regains its earlier clarity. This small act of maintenance is one of the few tangible markers of time's passage, along with the slowly diminishing piles of material at the edge of the platform and the slow invisible wheeling of the stars overhead. The night has no other clocks, no other measures of progress, and Peter has no need of them. The kiln itself is clock enough, its steady, rhythmic breathing, and its slow, even consumption of fuel, marking the hours with a precision that no mechanical device could match. The relationship between Peter and the kiln in these deep, quiet hours is one of complete and mutual understanding, a partnership that has been built over many years of shared nights, and that now requires no words, no conscious thought, no active effort. He knows the kiln's moods and its needs, its small variations and its constants, its quiet voice and its silent language of heat and light and sound, and the kiln, in its own inanimate way, responds to his care with a steady, reliable performance that asks only for his continued, unhurried presence. This understanding is not something he could explain to another person. It is a knowledge that lives in his hands and his eyes and the soles of his feet, a bodily wisdom that has been passed down through generations of lime burners and that he has made his own through the simple, patient accumulation of experience. Standing in the warm, glowing presence of the kiln, with the river murmuring far below and the stars burning cold and bright overhead, Peter feels a sense of completeness that he has never found anywhere else. A quiet, wordless satisfaction that fills the long night hours with a gentle, steady peace. The entire mass of stone and fire inside the kiln is now harmonizing, the temperature and the draft and the rate of descent all balanced in a perfect, self-sustaining equilibrium that requires only the smallest adjustments to maintain. The charge subsides with a sound that is not a crash or a roar, but a deep, slow, tired breath. A vast internal shifting that Peter feels through his boots as a faint, low vibration rather than hears with his ears. It is the sound of a process that is working exactly as it should, the sound of limestone becoming quicklime, of ancient sea creatures releasing their captured carbon into the air, of fuel returning its stored sunlight to the world in the form of heat. This sound, this deep, settling groan, is the voice of the earth itself in transformation, and Peter, who has spent his life in the service of this transformation, accepts it with the same quiet reverence that he would offer to the turning of the seasons or the flow of the river below. He stands at the center of the platform, the iron bar resting against his hip, the lantern blowing beside him, the kiln sighing its slow, steady breath, and he lets the night flow around him like the water flows around the stones in the riverbed. The hours pass without hurry, without tension, without any of the sharp edges that characterize the waking daylight world. There is only the warmth, the glow, the deep resonant hum, and the steady, watchful presence of the lime burner, keeping his silent vigil over the fire that he has tended through so many nights and will tend through many more, until the first pale light of dawn begins to soften the darkness above the eastern rim of the gorge. The first change is so subtle that Peter feels it before he sees it, a shift in the quality of the darkness that presses against the edges of the lantern's small circle of light. The blackness that has held the gorge through all the long hours of his shift has begun to lose some of its depth. Not brightening exactly, but thinning, as if the darkness itself were a fabric that has been stretched very slightly, allowing the faintest possible hint of something else to show through its weave. Peter, standing in one of his long, still intervals beside the warm mouth of the kiln, notices this change without breaking his steady, unhurried rhythm, his eyes lifting from the shimmering heat haze to the dark outline of the opposing cliff edge, which has begun to sharpen against the sky in a way it did not before. The silhouette of the rim, which earlier was almost indistinguishable from the heavens, now stands out as a crisp black line, a clear division between the solid rock and the space above it. And this sharpening is the first true sign that the long night is beginning its slow, gentle retreat. The stars, which have been burning with a cold, steady brilliance through all the hours of loading, have started to fade one by one, the faintest of them disappearing first, as if they were tiny flames being blown out by a distant, invisible breath. The brighter stars remain, but their light has become somehow thinner, less piercing, and the dense, glittering band of the Milky Way that arched across the sky has softened into a more diffuse, milky glow that seems to be receding, pulling back into the fabric of the heavens. The constellations that Peter has been reading all night, the Great Bear and Cassiopeia and the others, are still visible, but they have lost their sharp, crystalline clarity, their edges blurring as the sky behind them begins to change from deep black to a color that is not yet blue, but is no longer entirely black, a deep, slow indigo that is the first stage of dawn's arrival. Peter watches this transformation with the same calm, patient attention that he has given to every other aspect of the night, and he notes the position of the fading stars against the rim of the gorge, calculating the remaining time with an accuracy that no clock could provide. The night is nearing its end. His shift is drawing to a close, but the kiln's burn continues, and will continue, without pause or interruption. The cold air of the gorge has reached its deepest, most penetrating chill in this last hour before dawn, the temperature dropping to its lowest point as the earth gives up the last of its stored warmth to the clear, open sky. Peter feels the cold on his cheeks and the tip of his nose, a sharp, clean sensation that contrasts with the steady, radiating warmth of the kiln against his side, and he draws his canvas coat a little closer around his shoulders, a small habitual adjustment that he makes without thinking. The warmth from the kiln feels more pronounced now against the cold dawn air, a steady island of heat that pushes back against the chill and creates a pocket of comfort around the charging platform. When he moves away from the kiln to gather a few more lumps of coal or a few more chunks of limestone, the cold rushes in to fill the space he has left, biting at his exposed skin and making his breath plume out in slow, thick clouds of vapor that hang in the still air for a long moment before dissipating. And when he returns to the kiln's warm presence, the heat wraps around him like a blanket, a gentle, enveloping sensation that is one of the quiet pleasures of the job. The sky above the eastern rim of the gorge begins to change more rapidly now, the color shifting through a sequence of deep, saturated blues that seem to be mixed from ink and water, a gradient that runs from the nearly black zenith down to a softer, more luminous tone just above the cliff edge. The stars in the east fade first, swallowed by this gathering light, while those in the west still cling to their faint, silvery gleam. But they too are fading, one by one, their ancient light no match for the slow, steady approach of the sun. Peter watches this progression with the same calm attention that he has given to every other detail of the night, and he feels no regret at the star's departure, no sense of loss. The dawn is simply the next part of the cycle, as natural and as inevitable as the loading of the kiln or the flow of the river below. The sound of the river, which has been a constant murmuring companion through all the hours of darkness, is now joined by a new note, a small, tentative sound that breaks the seamless texture of the water's voice. It is the first hesitant call of a bird, a single tentative note that rises from somewhere in the dark tangle of scrub along the riverbank, a sound that is half a question and half a statement. The bird, a blackbird perhaps, or an early rising robin, calls once and then falls silent, as if testing the quality of the air and finding it not yet quite ready for full song. After a long pause it calls again, a little more confidently this time, and then another bird, further up the gorge, answers with a different, slightly shriller note, and the two calls hang in the cold, still air before fading back into the river's steady murmur. This small exchange is the first sign that the world beyond the kiln platform is beginning to wake, that the long, silent night is giving way to the sounds of living things, and Peter, listening to the birds with a quiet, absent appreciation, continues his slow, methodical work without pause. He takes up the basket for what he knows will be one of the last times this shift, carrying it to the coal pile and filling it with a partial load. Just a few of the glossy black lumps that remain in the diminishing heap. The coal pile, which was a substantial dark mound at the start of the night, has shrunk to a low, scattered accumulation of fragments, and the limestone pile beside it has been reduced by the same steady, patient consumption. Peter will not be the one to finish these piles. The day shift will see to that, carrying the last of the stone and fuel into the kiln while the sun climbs above the moor, and then a new delivery will arrive from the quarry and the coal pit, replenishing the supplies for the next night's burn. The work is a continuous, unbroken thread, a relay that passes from hand to hand, and Peter is simply one link in a chain that stretches back through years and decades, connecting him to the lime burners who came before and the ones who will come after. He carries the basket to the charging mouth and tips the coal in with the same smooth, controlled motion that he has used all night, watching the black fragments tumble down onto the warm, glowing surface of the charge below. The heat shimmer above the mouth is still strong, a transparent, wavering column that speaks of the intense fire burning deep within the shaft, and the warmth on his face is a pleasant, familiar sensation as he leans over the opening to check the level of the charge. The surface of the stone bed has subsided slightly since his last addition, a slow, imperceptible settling that is the proof of the calcination proceeding below, and he uses the iron bar to gently nudge the new coal into a more even distribution, the blunt end scraping across the stones with a soft, gritty sound. Then he returns the basket to its place and walks to the limestone pile, the routine continuing even as the darkness retreats, even as his shift approaches its end. The next basket is limestone, a partial load of the pale, heavy chunks, and he carries it to the mouth and tips it in, the stones clattering down onto the fresh coal with their familiar, percussive sound, louder and more distinct than the soft rustle of the fuel. He levels the surface with the wooden rake, the tines scraping across the stone in a slow, sweeping motion that has become as automatic as breathing. And then he sets the rake aside and stands still for a moment, his hands resting on the warm rim of the charging mouth, his eyes moving across the scene that he will soon hand over to another man. The sky is now a deep, clear blue that grows lighter by the minute, and the cliff walls, which were invisible black shapes for most of the night, have begun to reveal their texture and color. The layers of limestone catching the first faint, indirect light and showing their pale, cool grey with a subtle, growing clarity. The detail of the gorge is emerging from the retreating darkness, like a drawing being slowly inked onto a pale paper, the lines and shapes resolving from vague, shadowy masses into distinct, recognizable forms. The scree slope below the platform, which was a single, undifferentiated darkness, now shows its individual boulders and scattered trees, the pale trunks of the birches standing out against the darker stone, their bare branches delicate and intricate against the lightening sky. The river, still hidden by the angle of the slope, is now a visible ribbon of moving silver grey, catching the sky's reflection in a long, sinuous gleam that winds between the dark masses of the banks, and the path up to the moor, the pale, crushed limestone track that Peter descended so many hours ago, is now clearly visible, its winding course traced in white against the darker rock and the low, brown vegetation of the gorge wall. Peter extinguishes the lantern, reaching up to the hook and pinching the wick between his leather-wrapped fingers, feeling the small hot sting of the flame before it dies away into a thin, curling wisp of smoke. The horn casing, which has been warm from the long burn, begins to cool immediately, and the small circle of yellow light that has been the center of his world for the entire shift vanishes, replaced by the growing grey illumination of the dawn. His eyes, which have been adapted to the lantern's glow and the deep darkness beyond, adjust quickly to the new light, and he can now see the whole platform and the kiln and the gorge with a clarity that was missing before. The lantern has served its purpose, and its purpose is now ended. The dawn will provide all the light that is needed for the final tasks of the shift. He takes one last walk around the kiln, a slow, methodical circuit that covers every side and every opening, a final check that he performs not because he expects to find anything wrong, but because the ritual of checking is part of the work's completeness, its quiet, unbroken discipline. He kneels before the draw hole, the low arch now clearly visible in the grey dawn light, and he peers into the tunnel at the deep, steady glow of the ember bed. The orange light has lost some of its dramatic intensity against the growing brightness of the day, but it is still there, a steady, pulsing warmth that tells him the fire is burning exactly as it should. The bed of embers is deep and even, the coals glowing with a uniform cherry-red intensity, and the pile of quicklime behind them is a white, crumbly mass that radiates a dry, intense heat. The draught is still pulling, the cool morning air flowing past him into the tunnel with a gentle, continuous movement, and the smell of calcium oxide, that sweet, dusty sharpness, rises from the draw hole and mingles with the clean, cold air of the gorge. He rises from his knee and walks slowly around the curving wall, placing his bare palm against the stonework at several different heights, feeling the temperature with the same careful, reading touch. The wall is warm throughout, the heat having penetrated the entire thickness of the stone over the long hours of the burn, and the temperature gradient is exactly what he expects, warmer near the base, where the fire is closest, and slightly cooler near the top, where the higher part of the charge is still warming. He pauses at each of the spy holes, removing the plugs and peering into the interior, and he sees the same steady, settled glow, the same slow, liquid movement of flame, the same orderly progression of the charge through the zones of heating and calcination. Everything is as it should be, the kiln is in perfect condition, and the burn will continue smoothly through the coming day. He completes his circuit at the charging platform, where the tools rest against the warm wall and the two piles of material, now much reduced, wait for the next man to use them. Peter tidies the workspace with a few simple habitual motions, stacking the willow baskets neatly beside the charging mouth, leaning the iron bar and the wooden rake in their proper places, and sweeping the platform one last time with a heather broom, clearing away the fresh dust and scattered fragments that have accumulated since his earlier sweeping. The bristles make their soft hushing sound on the stone, and the fine, pale powder rises in small clouds that drift away on the still morning air, catching the growing light with a faint, ghostly shimmer. The platform, when he is finished, is clean and orderly, ready for the day shift to begin their work, and Peter stands back and surveys the scene with a quiet, satisfied attention, the same attention he has given to every task throughout the night. The sound of footsteps reaches him now, a soft, regular crunch of boots on the crushed limestone path above. He looks up toward the rim of the gorge, his eyes following the pale ribbon of the track as it winds up the cliffside, and he sees a figure descending toward him, a man in dark, simple clothes carrying a covered lantern that is not lit, its purpose unnecessary now in the growing daylight. The man is the day shift lime burner, a younger man named Thomas who has been working with Peter for several years, learning the rhythms of the kiln and the language of the fire, and he walks with the same slow, careful pace that Peter used when he first arrived in the darkness so many hours ago. Peter waits on the platform, his hands resting on the handle of the broom, and he watches the approach with a calm, quiet welcome, the same welcome he has offered at the end of every shift for as long as he can remember. Thomas reaches the platform and nods a greeting, his boots sounding on the swept stone, and his eyes move over the kiln, the piles, the tools, and the shimmering heat above the charging mouth, reading the scene with the same quick, practiced glance that Peter himself would use. The two men stand together for a moment, exchanging a few quiet words about the state of the burn, the level of the charge, the quality of the stone, and the expected progress of the day. A simple, factual exchange that covers everything the day shift needs to know without any unnecessary elaboration. Peter relays the information clearly and calmly, his voice low and even, and Thomas listens with the same quiet attention, nodding occasionally, his eyes never leaving the kiln. The transition from one shift to the next is seamless, a smooth, unbroken flow of responsibility that ensures the kiln never goes unattended, the fire never falters, the work never stops. When the exchange is complete, Peter hands Thomas the iron bar, the tool that has been his companion through the night, and Thomas takes it with a familiar grip, his hand closing around the worn, blackened iron as if it were an extension of his own arm. Peter retrieves his extinguished lantern from its hook, the horn casing now cool to the touch, and he tucks it under his arm, ready to carry it back up the path to the moor. He takes one last look at the kiln, the steady shimmer above the mouth, the deep, resonant hum of the fire, the gentle, radiating warmth that has been his constant companion through the dark hours, and he feels the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a shift completed, a fire tended and passed on. Then he turns toward the path, the same pale ribbon of crushed limestone that he descended in the deep darkness, and he begins the slow, steady climb back to the moor, his canvas coat rustling softly with his movement and his boots making their familiar rhythmic sound on the stone. The dawn light grows stronger as he climbs, the eastern sky brightening through a series of soft pastel colors that wash the gorge in a gentle, warm-toned light, the first direct rays of the sun catching the very top of the cliff walls and painting them in pale gold. The birds are singing more confidently now, their calls multiplying and blending into a soft, scattered chorus that fills the gorge with a new, lively music, a counterpoint to the river's ancient, steady murmur. Peter climbs steadily, his pace unhurried, his breathing even, and he carries the spent lantern and the quiet memory of the night's slow, patient labor up toward the high moor and the cottage where he will sleep through the daylight hours, resting for the next shift when he will descend the path again and resume the gentle, unbroken ritual of stone and fire. The kiln continues to burn, the charge continues to descend, and the work, as it always has and always will, goes quietly on.